Every parent's worst nightmare became Sheriff Cole Mercer's reality on a dusty Tuesday morning in 1887. The words that came from 8-year-old Hattie Dawson's trembling lips would shake him to his very soul. There she sat in her wooden wheelchair, on the general store steps, dirt and tears streaking her small face. Her voice was barely a whisper, but what she said made this hardened lawman's hands tremble. She spoke of things no child should ever know, of pain inflicted by men who wore respectable faces during Sunday service. What began as checking on a hurt little girl became something much darker. A web of secrets stretched through their quiet frontier town, reaching into places Cole never imagined. The deeper he dug, the more dangerous it became. But when a child cries out for justice, how far would you go to give it to her? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sheriff Cole Mercer had worn his father's badge for 12 years, and in all that time, he'd never felt its weight quite like this morning. The tarnished silver star pressed against his chest as he knelt beside Hattie Dawson's wheelchair, trying to make sense of what he'd just heard. The badge had been passed down through 3 generations of lawmen, each one carrying it with the solemn understanding that sometimes protecting people meant facing the darkest corners of human nature. Millbrook stretched before him in the morning light, a town of 800 souls nestled between rolling hills and endless prairie. Weathered storefronts lined Main Street like tired sentinels, their wooden facades bleached by decades of unforgiving sun. The general store where Hattie sat belonged to her family, a modest establishment that had served the community since the town's founding 20 years earlier. Behind its familiar walls, bolts of fabric and barrels of flour created the comfortable chaos of frontier commerce. Cole had been making his morning rounds when Mrs. Patterson from the boarding house flagged him down. Her weathered face creased with worry. "Sheriff, you'd better check on the Dawson girl," she'd said, wringing her hands in her apron. "She's been sitting out there since dawn, crying something fierce." Now, as he studied Hattie's tear-streaked face, Cole felt something cold settle in his stomach. The girl's wheat-colored hair hung in tangles around her shoulders, and her blue dress, once carefully pressed, was torn at the sleeve. But it was her eyes that troubled him most. They held a knowledge no 8-year-old should possess, a shadow that spoke of innocence violently stolen. "Can you tell me again what happened, sweetheart?" Cole asked, his voice gentle as summer rain. He'd removed his hat, holding it in his calloused hands as he crouched to meet her at eye level. Everything about his posture spoke of patience and safety, lessons learned from his own father about earning trust from those who'd been hurt. Hattie's small fingers gripped the wheels of her chair, knuckles white with tension. The wheelchair itself was a marvel of craftsmanship, built by Hans Müller, the town's carpenter, after an accident had stolen the use of her legs 2 years earlier. What Cole hadn't known, what nobody had thought to question, was how that accident had really happened. "He said it only hurts the first time," Hattie whispered, her voice so quiet Cole had to lean closer to hear. But he was wrong. It hurt every time. The words hit Cole like a physical blow. In 12 years of law enforcement, he'd seen bar fights that left men broken, cattle rustling that destroyed families' livelihoods, and occasional crimes of passion that shocked the community. But this was something else entirely. This was evil wearing a familiar face, hiding behind respectability and trust. Dr. Benjamin Hayes emerged from his office across the street, his medical bag in hand and his usual purposeful stride slightly hurried. At 62, Hayes had served as Millbrook's physician for over 2 decades, delivering most of the town's children and tending their injuries with equal dedication. His grey beard was meticulously trimmed, and his dark suit spoke of professional dignity, even in this rough frontier setting. "Sheriff Mercer," Dr. Hayes called, his voice carrying across the dusty street. "Mrs. Patterson mentioned you might need me to take a look at young Hattie." Cole stood, his 6-foot frame unfolding with the careful movements of a man who'd learned to project calm authority even when his insides churned. His brown hair was beginning to show silver at the temples, a testament to the weight of responsibility he'd carried since his father's death. The badge caught the morning light as he turned to face the doctor. "Doc, I think we need to have a conversation about some things," Cole said, his words measured but carrying an undertone that made Hayes pause mid-stride. "About injuries that maybe don't get talked about enough." Something flickered across the doctor's weathered features, a shadow of recognition that told Cole his growing suspicions might have merit. Hayes had been in this town long enough to see patterns, to notice things that others might miss or choose to ignore. His Hippocratic oath demanded he do no harm. But what happened when doing no harm meant breaking a silence that protected the guilty? Deputy Sam Rodriguez rounded the corner from behind the sheriff's office, his young face already showing the serious cast that marked men who took their duties seriously. At 25, Sam had been Cole's right hand for 3 years, learning the subtle art of frontier law enforcement. His dark eyes held intelligence and compassion, qualities that made him particularly effective with the town's children and families. "Morning, Sheriff," Sam said, tipping his hat to Hattie with gentle courtesy before noticing the tension in Cole's stance. "Everything all right here?" Cole met his deputy's eyes, seeing the sharp attention that made Sam such a valuable partner. "Sam, I need you to walk Miss Hattie home to her mother. Stay with them until I get there." He turned back to the girl, his voice softening. "Hattie, I want you to tell your mama that Sheriff Cole is going to make sure nobody hurts you anymore. Can you do that for me?" The child nodded, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks as Sam gently took hold of her wheelchair handles. As they moved away down Main Street, Cole watched the careful way Sam adjusted his stride to avoid the worst of the ruts, the protective way he positioned himself between the girl and the curious glances of other townspeople. Good instincts, Cole thought. They'd need them for what was coming. Mayor Edmund Whitman chose that moment to emerge from the First National Bank, his considerable bulk straining against a vest that had fit better in younger years. At 55, Whitman had held the mayor's office for 8 years, presiding over Millbrook's gradual growth with the jovial manner of a man who genuinely enjoyed politics. His handlebar mustache was waxed to perfection, and his gold watch chain caught the light as he approached. "Cole, my boy," Whitman called with his usual hearty greeting. "Beautiful morning, isn't it? Though I hear there's been some commotion. Down here? Nothing serious, I hope." The question felt loaded, though Cole couldn't quite put his finger on why. Whitman's pale eyes held a sharpness that didn't match his genial tone, and Cole found himself studying the mayor's face with new attention. In a town this size, everyone knew everyone else's business, or thought they did. But what if some business was deliberately kept hidden? "Just checking on one of our citizens, Edmund," Cole replied carefully, making sure everyone in Millbrook feels safe and protected. Of course," Whitman nodded, his smile never wavering. "That's what we elected you for. Though I do hope we're not letting childish imaginings create unnecessary alarm. You know how young ones can get confused about things." The casual dismissal of Hattie's pain sent ice through Cole's veins, but his expression remained neutral. 20 years of living in this town had taught him to read the currents beneath polite conversation, and something in Whitman's manner set off every instinct his father had trained into him. Dr. Hayes cleared his throat diplomatically. "Perhaps we should continue this discussion in my office, Sheriff. I believe there are some medical matters we should review." Cole nodded, tipping his hat to the mayor. "Always a pleasure, Edmund. Give my regards to Mrs. Whitman." As they crossed toward the doctor's office, Cole felt the weight of watching eyes. Mrs. Eleanor Price stood in the doorway of her boarding house, her severe black dress making her look like a raven against the whitewashed wood. At 48, she ran the town's modest orphanage with iron discipline, housing the handful of children whose parents had been claimed by disease, accident, or the unforgiving frontier life. Her grey eyes followed their progress with an intensity that made Cole's skin crawl. The orphanage itself occupied a two-story building at the far end of Main Street, its windows always clean, but somehow never bright. Cole had never paid much attention to it before. Orphanages were necessary institutions, after all, places where unfortunate children could be cared for until suitable families could be found. But now he found himself wondering about those children, about how they spent their days, about who else might have access to them. Inside Dr. Hayes's office, the familiar smell of carbolic acid and medicinal herbs created an atmosphere of professional competence. Medical texts lined shelves alongside jars of various remedies, and Hayes's desk bore the neat organization of a man who took his responsibilities seriously. But when the doctor closed the door behind them, his professional composure cracked slightly. "Sheriff," Hayes began, then stopped, seeming to struggle with words. His hands trembled slightly as he set down his medical bag. "I've been practicing medicine in this town for 23 years. I've seen injuries that made me question my faith in human decency." Cole waited, recognizing the careful way Hayes was choosing his words. Sometimes the most important conversations happened in the spaces between what was said aloud. "There are injuries that don't come from falling off horses or playing too rough," Hayes continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "Injuries that follow patterns, injuries that appear on children who seem afraid of their own shadows." "How many children are we talking about, Doc?" Hayes moved to his desk, opening a drawer with a key he wore on a chain around his neck. From it, he withdrew a leather-bound journal, not his official medical records, but something more personal. The pages were filled with his careful handwriting, dates and descriptions that painted a picture Cole wished he didn't have to see. 17 children over the past 5 years, Hayes said, his voice hollow. All between the ages of 6 and 12. All with injuries consistent with... He couldn't finish the sentence. Cole felt his father's badge seemed to grow heavier against his chest. 17 children. In a town of 800 people, that represented nearly every child in the community. The scope of what Hayes was suggesting seemed impossible, yet the doctor's anguish was unmistakably genuine. "Why didn't you report this before, Doc?" Hayes laughed bitterly, a sound devoid of humor. "Report it to whom, Sheriff? The mayor? A town council. Do you have any idea who sits on that council? Who donates the most money to the church, to the school, to every civic improvement this town has seen?" The implication hit Cole like a thunderbolt. If Hayes was right, if there truly was a pattern of abuse spanning years and involving multiple children, then the perpetrators weren't strangers lurking in the shadows. They were pillars of the community, men whose names appeared on buildings, and whose word carried weight in every decision that mattered. A soft knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Sarah Chen entered hesitantly, her dark hair pulled back in the practical style of a schoolteacher. At 28, she was relatively new to Millbrook, having arrived 2 years earlier to take over the one-room schoolhouse when the previous teacher moved back east. Her intelligence and dedication had quickly won over parents and children alike, but Cole noticed something different in her demeanor today, a tension that hadn't been there before. "I'm sorry to interrupt, Sheriff," Sarah said, her voice carefully controlled. "But I heard you were asking questions about children who might have been hurt." Cole exchanged a glance with Dr. Hayes. "Yes, Miss Chen. Do you have something you'd like to share?" Sarah's hands were clasped tightly in front of her, her knuckles white with tension. "There are things I've noticed in my classroom. Children who flinch when adults approach. Children who draw pictures that no child should know how to draw. Children who seem afraid to go home." The room fell silent except for the steady tick of Hayes's pocket watch. 3 adults, each carrying pieces of a horrible truth that was beginning to take shape in the morning light, filtering through the office windows. "I've been keeping notes," Sarah continued, reaching into her school bag to withdraw a small journal. "Not official records, you understand. Just observations, patterns I hoped I was imagining." Cole accepted the journal with hands that wanted to shake. The pages contained carefully documented observations written in Sarah's precise handwriting. Tommy Fletcher won't let anyone touch his shoulders. Mary Sullivan draws the same frightening figure in every picture, a large man with reaching hands. Little Peter from the orphanage hasn't spoken in class for 6 months. Jesus Christ, Cole whispered, forgetting himself in the presence of the schoolteacher. Sheriff, Dr. Hayes said quietly, I think it's time you knew about the Gentlemen's Club. The name hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Cole had heard whispers of such an organization, wealthy men who met regularly to discuss business and civic matters. It had seemed harmless enough, the kind of fraternal association common in frontier towns where men of means sought fellowship with their peers. Every second Thursday, Hayes continued, they meet in the back room of the old mining office on Prospect Street. Thomas Blackwood, Edgar Mills from the bank, a few of the bigger ranchers. They call it discussing town business, but you think it's something else, Cole finished. Hayes nodded grimly. I think it's where they decide which children are most vulnerable, which families are too poor or too powerless to cause trouble if something happens to their little ones. The magnitude of what they were discussing settled over Cole like a heavy blanket. If Hayes and Sarah were right, if there truly was an organized group of men systematically preying on the town's most defenseless citizens, then everything he thought he knew about Millbrook was a lie. The friendly faces at church, the respected businessmen who contributed to civic improvements, the very foundation of civilized society in their small community. It could all be an elaborate facade hiding something monstrous. I need to get back to Hattie and her mother, Cole said finally, standing and setting his hat firmly on his head. Doc, I want you to go through that journal again. Make note of every child, every injury, every date. Miss Chen, I need you to do the same with your observations. And both of you, be careful who you talk to about this. As he reached the door, Hayes called after him. Sheriff, that badge you wear, your father would be proud of what you're about to do. Cole touched the silver star through his shirt, feeling its familiar weight settle into something approaching resolve. His father had taught him that a lawman's first duty was to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. In 12 years of wearing the badge, he'd never faced a test quite like this one. Outside, Millbrook continued its morning routine with deceptive normalcy. Shopkeepers swept their storefronts, children played in the dust, and the sound of hammers rang from the blacksmith's shop. But underneath the surface of ordinary frontier life, Cole now sensed something darker. Predators moving through their community like wolves among sheep, protected by respectability and silence. The Dawson house sat at the end of Elm Street, a modest 2-story home with a wraparound porch that had seen better days. Cole found Deputy Rodriguez sitting on the front steps with Hattie, the two of them engaged in quiet conversation. The girl's mother, Martha Dawson, emerged from the house carrying a tray of fresh biscuits, her face bearing the worried expression of a woman who sensed her world was about to change. Sheriff Mercer, Martha said, her voice carefully neutral. Sam here says you wanted to speak with us about Hattie. Cole accepted the offered biscuit with genuine gratitude, recognizing it as Martha's way of maintaining normalcy in an abnormal situation. At 34, she'd been widowed 3 years earlier when her husband died in a mining accident, leaving her to raise Hattie alone while running the family store. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a practical bun, and her calloused hands spoke of honest work and determination. Mrs. Dawson, I need to ask some difficult questions, Cole said gently, about Hattie's accident 2 years ago, about how she came to need that wheelchair. Martha's face went pale, her eyes darting to her daughter before meeting Cole's steady gaze. What kind of questions, Sheriff? The kind that might help me understand who's been hurting children in this town. The silence stretched between them like a taut rope, heavy with unspoken truths and years of carefully buried pain. Martha Dawson's hands shook as she set down the tray, the delicate china rattling against the wooden surface. Hattie had gone. very still in her wheelchair, her small fingers gripping the armrests with white-knuckled intensity. "Mrs. Dawson," Cole said softly, removing his hat in a gesture of respect. "Whatever happened to Hattie, whatever's been happening to other children, in this town, none of it is your fault. But I need to know the truth if I'm going to stop it." Martha's composure cracked like ice in spring thaw. Tears spilled down her cheeks as she knelt beside her daughter's wheelchair, gathering Hattie's small hands in her own. "I suspected," she whispered. "God help me, I suspected something was wrong, but I was so scared. We're just two women alone in this town, Sheriff. Who would believe us? Who would protect us?" Deputy Rodriguez shifted uncomfortably on the porch steps, his young face grave with the weight of what they were discussing. Cole could see the pieces falling into place in Sam's mind. The careful way certain men in town interacted with children, the whispered conversations that stopped when law enforcement approached, the subtle web of influence that kept questions from being asked. "Tell me about the accident," Cole said gently. "The one that put Hattie in the wheelchair." Hattie's voice was barely audible. "It wasn't an accident." The words hung in the morning air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Martha's sob caught in her throat as she pulled her daughter closer, years of protective silence finally breaking under the weight of truth. "She came home that day covered in bruises," Martha said, her voice thick with anguish. "Said she'd fallen down the stairs at the orphanage while visiting the other children, but the bruises, they were in places you don't get from falling downstairs. And her back," Cole felt ice form in his stomach. "Who was at the orphanage?" "That day, Hattie," the child's blue eyes, far too knowing for her 8 years, met his with heartbreaking directness. "The nice men who helped Mrs. Price with the children. They said they were teaching us games, special games that good little girls play with grown-ups." Sam Rodriguez stood abruptly, his hand instinctively moving toward his sidearm before he caught himself. The young deputy's face had gone ashen, his jaw clenched tight enough to crack teeth. Cole recognized the look, righteous anger barely held in check by professional discipline. "Mrs. Dawson, I need you to think carefully," Cole said. "Do you remember any names? Anyone specific who might have been there that day?" Martha wiped her eyes with her apron, drawing on the strength that had carried her through widowhood and single motherhood. "Mr. Blackwood was there. I remember because his carriage was outside when I came to collect Hattie. And Mayor Whitman, he made a point of telling me how generous it was of him to spend time with the orphan children. Thomas Blackwood." The name settled in Cole's mind like a stone dropped in still water, sending ripples of implication in all directions. Blackwood owned the largest ranch in the county, employed half the men in town, and contributed generously to every church and civic cause. His word carried weight that could make or break families, his influence reaching into every corner of their small community. "Sheriff," Hattie said suddenly, her small voice cutting through the heavy atmosphere, "there's something else, something I drew." She reached under the cushion of her wheelchair, retrieving a folded piece of paper with the secretive manner of a child hiding treasures from adult eyes. The drawing was rendered in careful pencil strokes, showing a large man with dark hair, standing over a small figure. What made Cole's blood run cold wasn't the crude artistry, it was the precise detail with which Hattie had drawn the man's distinctive silver belt buckle, the one shaped like a longhorn steer that Thomas Blackwood wore to church every Sunday. "Jesus," Sam breathed, leaning over Cole's shoulder to study the drawing. "That's evidence," Cole said firmly, folding the paper carefully and tucking it into his vest pocket. "Mrs. Dawson, do you have somewhere safe you and Hattie can stay? Maybe relatives in another town?" Martha shook her head, fresh fear replacing the relief that had come with finally telling the truth. "Sheriff, we don't have anyone. And even if we did, the store is all we have. If we leave, if you stay, you might not live to worry about the store." Cole interrupted, his voice harder than he'd intended. He immediately softened his tone, seeing the terror in both mother and daughter's faces. "I'm sorry, but Martha, if what we're talking about is true, then powerful men in this town have a lot to lose if the truth comes out. They won't hesitate to silence anyone who threatens them. A shadow fell across the porch as Dr. Hayes approached, his medical bag in hand and his face grim with purpose. Behind him walked Sarah Chen, her schoolteacher's poise intact despite the circumstances that had brought them all together. Cole noted how naturally they'd gravitated toward each other, three adults who'd independently noticed something wrong with their community's children, now united by terrible necessity. "Sheriff," Dr. Hayes said without preamble, "I need to show you my journal, the complete one, not just the excerpts we discussed earlier." He withdrew a leather-bound book from his bag, its pages thick with careful documentation, spanning years. Cole accepted it with hands that wanted to shake, recognizing that he was about to see the full scope of what they were facing. The entries were methodical and heartbreaking. Names, dates, injuries described in clinical detail that couldn't disguise their horrific nature. Tommy Fletcher, age 7, treated for internal injuries sustained in a fall from his bicycle. Mary Sullivan, age 9, multiple bruises and lacerations from playing too rough with the other children. Peter Morrison from the orphanage, age 10, injuries too severe to be adequately explained by any childhood accident. 17 children, Hayes said quietly, some of them multiple times, all of them too afraid or too ashamed to tell the truth about what happened to them. Sarah Chen stepped forward, her own journal clutched in her hands. "It's not just the physical injuries, Sheriff. The behavioral changes, the fear responses, the way certain children react when specific adults enter the schoolroom. I've been documenting everything for months, hoping I was wrong, but knowing in my heart that I wasn't." Cole looked up from the medical journal, his trained eye cataloging the patterns that emerged from Hayes's careful documentation. The timing of injuries often coincided with the gentlemen's club meetings. The children affected were predominantly from poor families or the orphanage, those with the least power to seek justice or protection. Most damning of all, several entries mentioned specific men who'd been present when children were brought in for treatment. "Thomas Blackwood's name appears in 7 different entries," Cole observed grimly. "Mayor Whitman in 5, Edgar Mills from the bank in 4. The 3 most powerful men in town," Sam added, his voice tight with controlled anger, men who could destroy anyone who tried to challenge them. Martha Dawson had been listening with growing horror, her protective instincts warring with the terrible realization of how widespread the abuse had been. "All those children," she whispered, "all those families suffering in silence, thinking they were alone." "You weren't alone," Sarah said firmly, kneeling beside Hattie's wheelchair. "None of you were alone. We just didn't know how to find each other until now." Cole closed the medical journal with deliberate care, his mind already working through the implications of what they'd discovered. If Hayes's documentation was accurate, if Sarah's observations held up under scrutiny, then they were looking at a conspiracy that had operated in plain sight for years. The men responsible weren't monsters hiding in the shadows. They were respected members of society who'd used their positions to prey on the most vulnerable. "We need more evidence," he said finally. "Documentation is good, but we need witnesses willing to testify. We need proof that will hold up in court." "Sheriff," Martha said hesitantly, "what if the court is part of it? Judge Morrison has been presiding over legal matters in this county for 15 years. His son Peter is one of the children in that journal." The implication hit Cole like a physical blow. If Judge Morrison was aware of what had happened to his own son and had done nothing to protect him, or worse, if he was complicit in the abuse, then the entire legal system they depended on for justice had been compromised. "Then we go above the local courts," Cole said with grim determination. "Federal marshals, territorial authorities, anyone with jurisdiction who isn't connected to Millbrook's power structure." Deputy Rodriguez nodded approvingly. "I've got contacts from my time in Santa Fe, Sheriff. Men who wear federal badges and aren't beholden to local interests. but we'll need ironclad evidence to bring them in." A distant sound made them all freeze. The rumble of approaching horses, the creak of leather and jingle of spurs that announced riders coming up Elm Street. Cole's hand moved instinctively toward his sidearm as he peered around the corner of the porch, counting 4 men on horseback, moving with the casual arrogance of those accustomed to going where they pleased. Thomas Blackwood rode at the head of the group, his imposing figure unmistakable even at a distance. The silver longhorn buckle at his waist caught the morning light, and his dark eyes surveyed the scene on the Dawson porch with calculating interest. Behind him rode Mayor Whitman, Edgar Mills, and a man Cole recognized as Jim Patterson, owner of the town's largest cattle operation and another pillar of respectable society. "Mrs. Dawson," Blackwood called as they approached, his voice carrying the easy authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "Lovely morning, isn't it? I hope there's nothing troubling going on here." Cole stepped forward, positioning himself between the mounted men and the family on the porch. His badge caught the light as he moved, a deliberate reminder of his authority, despite being outnumbered. "Mr. Blackwood, just conducting some routine inquiries. Nothing that concerns you." "Oh, but everything in this town concerns me, Sheriff," Blackwood replied with a smile that never reached his eyes, "especially when it involves wild accusations being made by people who might not have the best grasp of reality." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Cole felt rather than saw Sam move to flank the riders, the young deputy's instincts sharp despite his relative inexperience. Dr. Hayes and Sarah Chen remained on the porch, their presence silent testimony to the growing alliance against Millbrook's hidden evil. "I wasn't aware anyone had made accusations about anything," Cole said carefully. "Just following up on some medical concerns Dr. Hayes brought to my attention." Mayor Whitman leaned forward in his saddle, his politician's smile as practiced as his words. "Sheriff, you know how much we all value your dedication to keeping our town safe, but sometimes dedicated men can get carried away, start seeing problems where none exist. It would be a shame if that dedication led to unnecessary trouble for good families." The mayor's eyes flicked meaningfully toward Martha and Hattie, another subtle threat wrapped in concern. Cole felt his temper rising, but kept his voice level. These men had operated with impunity for years, protected by their status and the silence of their victims. But that protection depended on fear and isolation, 2 things that were rapidly breaking down. "Gentlemen," Cole said with deliberate formality, "I appreciate your concern for the community. Now, if you'll excuse us, we have official business to conclude." Edgar Mills spoke for the first time, his banker's voice smooth as silk over steel. "Of course, Sheriff, though I do hope you'll remember that prosperity in a town like ours depends on maintaining certain standards, certain levels of discretion about matters that might reflect poorly on our community's reputation." The words hung in the air like poison gas. 4 of the most powerful men in Millbrook had just made their position clear. The truth about their crimes was less important than protecting their reputations and their ability to continue operating without interference. Blackwood gathered his reins, preparing to wheel his horse around. "Sheriff, I trust you'll handle whatever this is with the wisdom and discretion we've come to expect from you. Some things are better left buried, don't you think?" As the 4 men rode away, their horses' hooves raising dust clouds in the morning air, Cole felt the weight of what they were facing settle fully on his shoulders. This wasn't just about investigating crimes, it was about taking on an entire power structure that had protected itself through fear, money, and influence. "They know," Martha whispered, gathering Hattie closer. "Dear God, they know we talked." "Let them know," Sarah said with quiet steel in her voice. "Let them understand that their victims aren't isolated and afraid anymore. Let them worry about what happens when truth stands up to power." Cole nodded, his father's badge seeming to burn against his chest with renewed purpose. "Mrs. Dawson, pack what you need for you and Hattie. You're both staying at the boarding house tonight where there are other people around. Sam, I want a rotation of deputies watching the house. Doc, Sarah, we need to start reaching out to other families, other children who might be willing to speak up now that they know they're not alone." As they began making practical arrangements for protection and investigation, Cole couldn't shake the feeling that they'd just crossed a line from which there would be no return. The men who'd confronted them weren't going to simply accept exposure and prosecution. They had too much to lose and too much power to wield in their own defense. But looking at Hattie's brave face, at Martha's determined expression, at the resolve in his allies' eyes, Cole knew they had something their opponents lacked. They had the truth on their side, and sometimes, just sometimes, that was enough to bring down even the mightiest walls of corruption and evil. The abandoned mining office on Prospect Street stood like a weathered tombstone against the evening sky, its broken windows and sagging roof testimony to fortunes lost when the silver played out 3 years earlier. But as Cole crouched behind a stack of rotting lumber across the street, he could see warm lamplight flickering through gaps in the boarded-up entrance. The Gentlemen's Club was meeting, just as Dr. Hayes had predicted they would on this second Thursday of the month. Deputy Sam Rodriguez emerged from the shadows beside him, his young face grim with purpose. "I counted 6 horses tied up behind the building, Sheriff. Blackwood's stallion, the mayor's mare, Mill's gelding, and 3 others I didn't recognize." Cole nodded, his eyes never leaving the decrepit structure. Hidden inside his vest pocket lay the documents they'd discovered that afternoon, meeting minutes from previous gatherings, written in Edgar Mill's precise handwriting and retrieved from the banker's office trash by Sarah Chen during her carefully planned reconnaissance. The pages contained coded language that would seem innocuous to casual observers, but their true meaning had become horrifyingly clear once decoded. Discussion of new opportunities for community mentorship, selecting vulnerable children, evaluation of family stability in target demographics, identifying families too poor or powerless to cause problems, resource allocation for special projects, deciding which children would be victimized next. The most damning entries were the financial records tucked between the meeting notes. Payments to Mrs. Eleanor Price for orphanage maintenance, substantial, enough to ensure her cooperation and silence. Contributions to Judge Morrison's re-election campaign, carefully timed to coincide with dismissed charges against club members. A web of corruption that reached into every institution that should have protected the innocent. "Sam, I want you to circle around and watch the back exit," Cole whispered. "Anyone tries to leave before the meeting's over, you follow them, but don't engage. We're gathering intelligence tonight, not making arrests." The young deputy nodded and melted back into the shadows with surprising grace for someone his size. Cole had chosen well when he'd pinned a badge on Sam Rodriguez 3 years earlier. The man had natural instincts for law enforcement and an unshakable moral compass that would be essential in the days ahead. A sound from inside the building drew Cole's attention back to his surveillance. Through a crack in the boarded window, he could see the flicker of multiple oil lamps and the shadows of men seated around what appeared to be a makeshift conference table. Thomas Blackwood's distinctive silhouette was unmistakable as he gestured. Emphatically, his commanding presence evident even from a distance. Cole eased closer, pressing his ear to a gap in the building's weathered siding. The voices inside were muffled but audible, their casual discussion of monstrous acts delivered in the same tones other men might use to debate cattle prices or weather patterns. "The Dawson situation needs to be handled delicately, Mayor," Whitman was saying, his politician's voice carrying even through the walls. "The girls already talked to the sheriff, and her mother seems inclined to make trouble. Martha Dawson is a widow with no connections and no money." Thomas Blackwood's deeper voice responded dismissively. "One word from any of us could destroy what little she has left. The store depends on credit from Edgar's bank, doesn't it?" Edgar Mill's precise tones confirmed the threat. "Indeed. Her loan comes due next month. It would be unfortunate if the..." Bank found reasons to call it in early, especially if certain questions arose about her family's character and stability. Cole's hands clenched into fists as he listened to them casually discuss destroying Martha Dawson's life to protect their crimes. These men wielded their economic power like weapons, targeting anyone who dared to challenge their authority or expose their sins. What about the sheriff himself? A voice Cole didn't recognize spoke up, one of the strangers whose horses Sam had spotted. Mercer's been asking uncomfortable questions around town. People are starting to whisper. Cole Mercer is his father's son, Blackwood said with what might have been grudging respect. Stubborn, idealistic, and too honest for his own good, but he's also alone. One man against an entire town's power structure doesn't have good odds. Perhaps he needs a reminder of how isolated his position really is, the mayor suggested. A demonstration of what happens to people who threaten the natural order of things. Cole felt ice form in his stomach at the casual way they discussed threats against him. He'd known that investigating powerful men carried risks, but hearing them plan his downfall with the same methodical care they applied to selecting victims drove home just how dangerous his situation had become. Gentlemen, we've operated successfully for 7 years, Mills interjected, his banker's caution evident. That success has depended on discretion, careful selection of targets, and maintaining our respectable facades. Direct action against a sitting sheriff could draw unwanted attention from territorial authorities. Edgar's right, Blackwood agreed. We handle this the way we've handled other problems, through economic pressure, social isolation, and if necessary, ensuring that troublesome individuals find reasons to relocate elsewhere. Violence should be a last resort. The conversation shifted to other topics, upcoming community events that Cole now recognized as opportunities to identify new victims, financial arrangements with Mrs. Price at the orphanage, and discussions of expanding their operation to neighboring towns. The casual efficiency with which they planned their crimes was perhaps more chilling than outright threats would have been. A hand touched Cole's shoulder, nearly causing him to jump out of his skin. Sam Rodriguez materialized beside him like a ghost, his expression urgent. Sheriff, we've got company. 3 riders approaching from the east. Looks like they're heading this way. Cole peered through the darkness, making out the silhouettes of mounted men against the star-filled sky. As they drew closer, he recognized one of them as Jim Patterson, the cattle rancher who'd accompanied the morning's intimidation visit to the Dawson house. The other 2 were strangers, but their bearing and equipment suggested they weren't local townspeople. Could be more club members arriving late, Sam whispered, or it could be hired help. The possibility that the gentlemen's club had brought in outside muscle added a new dimension to their investigation. If Blackwood and his associates felt threatened enough to import gunmen, then Cole's small sheriff's department was potentially facing professional killers rather than simply corrupt local officials. The 3 riders dismounted at the abandoned building's rear entrance, their low voices carrying in the still night air. Cole caught fragments of conversation, references to cleanup work and permanent solutions that confirmed his worst fears about their intentions. Sam, we need to get back to town, Cole whispered urgently. If they're planning to move against us tonight, Martha and Hattie could be in immediate danger. They withdrew from their surveillance position with practiced stealth, making their way through Millbrook's darkened streets toward the boarding house where Cole had arranged temporary shelter for the Dawsons. The town that had seemed so familiar and safe just days earlier now felt hostile and threatening, every shadow potentially concealing an enemy. Mrs. Patterson's boarding house stood at the corner of Main and Cedar Streets, its 2-story frame structure offering both security and witnesses for anyone staying there. Cole had chosen it specifically because the elderly proprietor maintained strict hours and kept careful track of her guests, qualities that would make it difficult for anyone to threaten the Dawsons without attracting attention. The front parlor window showed warm lamplight, and Cole could see Martha Dawson's silhouette as she helped Hattie prepare for bed. The sight of the mother and daughter going through their evening routine in apparent safety brought him a moment's relief, but he knew their protection was fragile at best. Sarah Chen emerged from the boarding house as they approached, her schoolteachers, composure intact despite the circumstances. "Sheriff, I've been waiting for you. We need to talk." She led them into Mrs. Patterson's small garden, where the scent of roses and the sound of crickets provided cover for their conversation. In her hands was a leather satchel containing what appeared to be additional documents. "I went through the school records this afternoon," Sarah reported quietly. "Attendance patterns, behavioral notes, medical excuses, everything going back 5 years. The patterns are even worse than we suspected." Cole accepted the satchel with grim resignation, knowing that each new piece of evidence would reveal fresh horrors while strengthening their case against the conspirators. Sarah's organizational skills and access to school records had proven invaluable in documenting the scope of the abuse. "How many more children are we talking about?" Sam asked, though his expression suggested he dreaded the answer. "At least 12 additional victims based on behavioral changes and attendance patterns that coincide with the medical journal entries," Sarah replied. "Children who became withdrawn, fearful, or aggressive after specific dates. Children who started having accidents that kept them home from school for days at a time." The magnitude of what they were facing continued to expand like ripples from a stone thrown in still water. What had begun as concern for one injured child had revealed a systematic campaign of abuse that had touched dozens of families over multiple years. "There's something else," Sarah continued, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "I found records of children who were transferred to other schools or sent to live with relatives after showing signs of trauma. Children who might have been removed from the community to prevent them from talking about their experiences." The implication was clear. The Gentlemen's Club hadn't just abused children, they'd potentially eliminated witnesses by forcing families to leave town or by removing children from their families entirely. The scope of their crimes extended far beyond what Cole had initially imagined. "We're dealing with more than just a local conspiracy," Cole realized. "This is an organized criminal enterprise that's been operating across multiple jurisdictions." For years, a distant sound made them all freeze, the soft thud of horses' hooves on packed earth, moving at a careful walk that suggested stealth rather than legitimate business. Cole peered around the corner of the boarding house, counting 4 riders moving slowly down Main Street in their direction. "Everyone inside now," he ordered quietly, his hand moving instinctively to his sidearm. "Mrs. Patterson's place has thick walls and multiple exits. We can defend it if necessary." As they slipped through the boarding house's back door, Cole couldn't shake the feeling that events were accelerating beyond his ability to control them. The men they were investigating weren't content to rely on economic pressure and social isolation. They were preparing for direct action that could turn deadly at any moment. Mrs. Patterson met them in her kitchen, her elderly face creased with worry, but her backbone straight with determination. "Sheriff, there are armed men watching this house. I've seen them from my upstairs window for the past hour." The confirmation that they were under surveillance drove home just how seriously the Gentlemen's Club was taking the threat to their operation. These weren't men who would simply accept exposure and prosecution. They had too much to lose and too many resources at their disposal to go quietly. "Ma'am, I need you to wake your other guests and have them gather in the central parlor," Cole instructed. "If there's trouble, I want everyone where we can protect them." As Mrs. Patterson hurried to comply, Cole found himself thinking about his father's advice from years earlier. Sometimes doing the right thing meant accepting that you might not live to see justice served. The badge he wore carried with it the obligation to protect the innocent, even at the cost of his own life. Martha Dawson appeared in the kitchen doorway, her face pale but resolute. "Sheriff, Hattie wanted me to give you this." She drew it this afternoon while we were waiting. The new drawing showed multiple figures, children with frightened faces surrounding by larger, threatening shapes. But in the corner of the paper, Hattie had drawn a figure wearing a star-shaped badge, standing protectively between the children and their tormentors. "She said to tell you that sometimes the good guys win," Martha added, her voice thick with emotion. "She believes in you, Sheriff. We all do." Dawn broke grey and threatening over Millbrook, with heavy clouds promising rain that would turn the town's dusty streets into treacherous mud. Cole stood at the boarding house window, watching the 4 riders who'd maintained their vigil throughout. The night finally withdrew as legitimate morning traffic began to fill Main Street. Their message had been clear. The Gentlemen's Club wanted everyone to know they were being watched. Hattie's hidden drawings lay spread across Mrs. Patterson's dining room table like a child's vision of hell, rendered in careful pencil strokes. Sarah Chen sat beside the girl's wheelchair, helping her explain each disturbing image with the gentle patience that made her such an effective teacher. The latest drawing showed the interior of what appeared to be the orphanage, with small figures cowering in corners while larger shapes loomed threateningly over them. "This room has a red door," Hattie said, pointing to a detail she'd colored with careful precision. "Mrs. Price said it was for special children who needed extra attention. But the children who went in there came out different, scared and hurt, and not wanting to talk to anyone." Martha Dawson's hands trembled as she poured coffee for the adults, her mother's instincts warring with the growing realization of how widespread the abuse had been. "All those children," she whispered, "all those families suffering alone, thinking they had nowhere to turn." Dr. Hayes entered through the boarding house's rear door, his medical bag in one hand and his expression grim with purpose. "Sheriff, I've been making house calls since before sunrise. 3 more families have agreed to let their children speak with us, but they're terrified of retaliation." Cole accepted the list of names with hands that wanted to shake. The Hendricks family, whose 10-year-old son David had shown signs of trauma following a camping trip organized by the Gentlemen's Club. The widow Chen, no relation to Sarah, whose 8-year-old daughter had stopped speaking entirely after spending time at the orphanage. The Patterson family, whose son had been among the children transferred to a better school in another county after behavioral problems at home. "How many more are we going to find, Doc?" Sam Rodriguez asked, his young face showing the strain of the revelations they'd uncovered. "Too many," Hayes replied simply, "but maybe enough to build a case that even corrupt local courts can't ignore." Sarah looked up from her work with Hattie, her schoolteacher's instincts sharp with concern. "Sheriff, there's something else we need to discuss. I've been thinking about the timing of these attacks, the way they've escalated recently. I don't think our investigation is the only thing that's changed." She moved to the window, gazing out at the morning traffic with troubled eyes. 3 months ago, Mrs. Price received a large financial contribution from an anonymous donor. The same week, Judge Morrison's nephew was appointed to a territorial position in Santa Fe. Around that same time, several families with questionable children quietly left town. Cole felt pieces of a larger puzzle clicking into place. "You think they're expanding their operation?" "I think they're preparing to relocate it," Sarah corrected. "Everything we've seen suggests they believe Millbrook is becoming too risky for their activities. They're eliminating witnesses, silencing potential victims, and establishing new bases of operation in communities where they'll have fresh hunting grounds." The implications were staggering. If the Gentlemen's Club was indeed preparing to abandon Millbrook after covering their tracks, then Cole's investigation represented perhaps the last chance to bring them to justice before they disappeared into new identities and new communities. "That explains the hired gunmen," Sam observed. "They're not just trying to silence us, they're trying to clean up loose ends before they relocate." A soft knock at the front door interrupted their planning session. Mrs. Patterson answered cautiously, returning moments later with Reverend Stone's nervous wife, Elizabeth. The minister's widow carried herself with the hunched shoulders of someone who'd lived in fear for too long. her graying hair escaping its careful bun, and her hands shaking as she clutched a worn Bible. "Mrs. Stone," Cole stood respectfully, offering her a chair at their improvised conference table. "I'm sorry for your loss, Mom. Your husband was a good man." Elizabeth Stone's laugh held no humor, only years of suppressed bitterness and pain. "Was he, Sheriff? Was he really? Because I've been living with the knowledge of what he knew, what he saw, and what he was too frightened to report for the past 7 years." She opened the Bible with reverent care, revealing pages filled with her late husband's careful handwriting. Names, dates, and observations filled the margins and blank spaces, creating a comprehensive record of the Gentlemen's Club's activities. Written in the coded language of biblical references and theological metaphors, he called it his record of sin, Elizabeth explained, her voice barely above a whisper. Every child he suspected had been harmed. Every family he believed was suffering in silence. Every instance where he wanted to speak out but was too afraid of the consequences. Cole accepted the annotated Bible with the reverence due to both its religious significance and its potential as evidence. Reverend Stone's hidden documentation provided an independent corroboration of the patterns they'd identified through medical records and school observations. More importantly, it included details about the club's activities that only someone with privileged access could have known. "Your husband documented specific meetings, specific participants, even specific victims," Sarah noted, studying the careful annotations. "This could be the evidence we need to convince federal authorities to intervene." Elizabeth Stone nodded slowly, tears beginning to flow down her weathered cheeks. He wanted to act, but they threatened him, threatened me, threatened to destroy the church and everyone who depended on it for support. In the end, his conscience ate away at him until he couldn't live with the silence anymore. The revelation that Reverend Stone's apparent suicide had actually been motivated by his inability to expose the conspiracy added another layer of tragedy to their growing understanding of the situation. How many other decent people had been forced into silence by threats against their families and livelihoods? "Mrs. Stone," Cole said gently, "are you willing to testify about what your husband knew, about the threats that were made against your family?" The elderly woman straightened her shoulders with determination that reminded Cole of her late husband's moral courage. "Sheriff, my husband died because he couldn't find the strength to stand up to evil. I won't make the same mistake." Dr. Hayes leaned forward, his medical training evident in the careful way he approached sensitive topics. "Mrs. Stone, your husband's notes mention children who were treated for injuries at times that correspond to our medical records. Did he ever discuss specific incidents with you?" "The Morrison boy," Elizabeth replied immediately. "Peter from the orphanage. My husband found him behind the church one Sunday morning, beaten so badly he could barely walk. When he tried to take the child to Dr. Hayes, Judge Morrison intervened, said it was a family matter that didn't concern the church." The detail about Judge Morrison protecting his own son's abuser while allowing the abuse to continue painted a picture of corruption so complete it defied belief. Yet the evidence continued to mount, each new revelation confirming the systematic nature of the crimes they were investigating. Hattie spoke up from her wheelchair, her young voice cutting through the heavy atmosphere with startling clarity. "Mrs. Stone, your husband was kind to me. After I got hurt, he used to visit and read Bible stories. He said God sees everything, even things that happen in secret." Elizabeth Stone knelt beside the child's wheelchair, taking Hattie's small hands in her own weathered ones. "He was right, dear one. God does see everything, and sometimes he works through good people like Sheriff Mercer to make sure justice is served." The moment was interrupted by urgent knocking at the front door. Mrs. Patterson returned from answering it, with Deputy Rodriguez at her heels, his face grim with news that Cole dreaded to hear. "Sheriff, we've got problems," Sam reported. "Dr. Hayes' office was broken into during the night. His medical records are gone, and someone left a message painted on his wall." "What kind of message?" Cole asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Mind your own business or join the preacher. The threat was as clear as it was chilling. The Gentlemen's Club was escalating their campaign of intimidation, moving from surveillance and economic pressure to direct action against anyone who threatened their operation. They took the official medical records, Hayes said grimly. But they don't know about the duplicate journal I keep at home. Still, this represents a significant escalation in their willingness to take risks. Sarah Chen stood at the window again, her trained eye cataloguing the morning activity on Main Street. Sheriff, there are more armed men in town today than I've ever seen. At least 8 riders I don't recognize, all carrying weapons and watching key buildings. The realization that the Gentlemen's Club had imported a small army to protect their interests drove home the scope of what they were facing. This wasn't just about exposing local corruption. It was about surviving long enough to see justice served. We need to get word to federal authorities immediately, Cole decided. Sam, I want you to ride to Santa Fe with copies of everything. We've collected. Don't trust the telegraph. They might have people watching the line. Sheriff, Martha Dawson spoke up from beside her daughter's wheelchair. What about the rest of us? If you send Sam away, that leaves you alone against all those men. Cole touched his father's badge through his shirt, feeling its familiar weight. Settle into resolve. Mrs. Dawson, sometimes standing alone, is exactly what wearing this badge means. But I won't be completely alone. I'll have all of you, and that's going to have to be enough. As they made final preparations for Sam's dangerous ride to Santa Fe, Cole couldn't shake the feeling that events were moving toward a confrontation that would determine not just the fate of Millbrook's children, but the very nature of justice in their small corner of the frontier. The men they were fighting had power, money, and ruthless determination on their side. But looking at Hattie's brave face, at the resolve in his allies' eyes, at the evidence of their crimes spread across Mrs. Patterson's dining table, Cole knew they had something more powerful than wealth or influence. They had the truth, and sometimes that was enough to change the world. The orphanage records lay scattered across Cole's desk, like leaves from a poisoned tree, each page revealing fresh horrors hidden behind administrative efficiency. Mrs. Eleanor Price had maintained meticulous documentation of every child who'd passed through her care. But the falsified adoption papers and forged transfer documents told a story far different from the official narrative of charitable work and community service. Sarah Chen sat across from him in the sheriff's office, her schoolteacher's training. Evident in the methodical way, she organized the evidence they'd recovered from the orphanage's hidden files. The break-in had been necessary after Mrs. Price mysteriously disappeared during the night, leaving behind only empty rooms and a safe full of incriminating documents that painted a picture of systematic exploitation spanning nearly a decade. Look at this pattern, Sarah said, pointing to a series of entries from 1883. Children arriving at the orphanage after their parents died in accidents, mining cave-ins, house fires, fever outbreaks that seemed to target specific families with no extended relatives. Cole studied the dates with growing horror. The supposed accidents that created orphans had occurred with suspicious regularity, often involving families who'd shown signs of questioning authority or challenging the established order in Millbrook. It was as if the Gentlemen's Club had engineered their own supply of vulnerable victims, 12 children reported as adopted by loving families in distant territories, he noted grimly. But no adoption papers, no forwarding addresses, no follow-up correspondence. These children simply vanished from the records. The implication was clear. Children who might have grown old enough to report their abuse had been permanently silenced through methods too horrible to contemplate. What had begun as an investigation into current crimes was revealing a trail of potential murders stretching back years. Dr. Hayes entered through the office's rear door, his medical bag clutched tightly, and his face bearing the strain of a man who'd seen too much evil in too short a time. "Sheriff, I've completed examinations of the 3 children whose families agreed to cooperate. The injuries are consistent with what we've documented previously. But there's something else you need to know." He set a small glass vial on the desk. Its contents a pale powder that caught the morning light, filtering through the office windows. "I found traces of laudanum in 2 of the children's systems, enough to make them compliant, but not enough to cause obvious intoxication." Sarah's face went pale as the implications sank in. They were drugging the children to make them easier to control and to ensure they wouldn't remember everything that happened to them. Hayes added grimly, "Laudanum in small doses can cause memory gaps, confusion, and a sense of dreamlike unreality that would make it difficult for victims to provide clear testimony about their experiences." Cole felt his father's badge seem to burn against his chest as the full scope of the conspiracy became clear. These men hadn't just abused children. They'd developed a sophisticated system for selecting, controlling, and silencing their victims. The medical expertise required to administer drugs safely suggested the involvement of someone with formal training. "Doc, who else in town has access to laudanum in those quantities?" Cole asked, though he suspected the answer would add another respected member of the community to their growing list of suspects. Hayes's reluctance to answer was confirmation enough. "Sheriff, there are only 3 sources in the county: my office, the veterinary supply warehouse, and the medical kit maintained by Judge Morrison for his circuit court duties," Cole finished. The revelation that the judge who would normally preside over any prosecution of the Gentlemen's Club had likely provided the drugs used to incapacitate victims represented perhaps the most damning evidence yet of how completely the conspiracy had penetrated every institution that should have protected the innocent. A commotion outside drew their attention to the street, where Deputy Rodriguez was returning from his mission to Santa Fe with a small escort of federal marshals in tow. Cole felt a moment's relief at the sight of his young deputy riding safely back into town, followed immediately by apprehension at the grim expressions on the marshals' faces. Marshal William Bradley dismounted with the efficient movements of a man accustomed to dangerous work, his badge catching the light as he surveyed Millbrook's main street with professional assessment. At 45, Bradley had spent 2 decades bringing federal justice to frontier communities, and his weathered face suggested he'd seen most forms of human evil during his career. "Sheriff Mercer," Bradley said, his voice carrying the authority of federal jurisdiction, "Deputy Rodriguez has briefed us on the situation here. What he's described, if accurate, represents one of the most extensive criminal conspiracies we've encountered in this territory." Cole invited the federal officers into his office, watching their faces as Sarah methodically presented the evidence they'd compiled. The orphanage records, medical documentation, school observations, and Reverend Stone's biblical annotations created a comprehensive picture of systematic abuse that spanned multiple years and involved most of Millbrook's civic leadership. "How many perpetrators are we looking at?" asked Marshal Bradley's lieutenant, a younger man named Carson, whose sharp eyes catalogued every detail of their presentation. "At minimum, 7 active participants," Cole replied. "Thomas Blackwood, Mayor Whitman, Edgar Mills, Judge Morrison, Mrs. Eleanor Price, and at least 2 others we haven't positively identified. But the scope of their operation suggests additional accomplices in neighboring communities." Marshal Bradley studied the orphanage records with particular attention, his expression growing darker as he absorbed the implications of the falsified adoptions and disappeared children. "Sheriff, what you're describing isn't just child abuse, it's organized crime on a scale that threatens the territorial government's ability to maintain law and order." The federal marshal's assessment carried weight beyond local concerns. If word spread that entire communities could be controlled by criminal conspiracies operating behind facades of respectability, it would undermine confidence in frontier justice and potentially lead to vigilante responses that could destabilize the entire region. "We need to move quickly." Bradley decided. These men have had years to establish their operation and cover their tracks. Every day we delay gives them more opportunity to eliminate evidence and silence witnesses. Sarah leaned forward with the urgency that had marked her involvement from the beginning. Marshal, they've already started that process. Mrs. Price disappeared. During the night, several families with potential victim children have quietly left town, and we have evidence they've imported armed men to protect their interests. The sound of approaching horses drew everyone to the window, where they could see Thomas Blackwood leading a group of 12 mounted men down Main Street with the confident bearing of someone who owned everything he surveyed. The riders weren't locals. Their equipment and bearing marked them as professional gunmen hired for serious work. That's an interesting development, Marshal Bradley observed, with the calm of an experienced lawman. Mr. Blackwood appears to be making a statement about his intentions. Cole watched the display of force with growing concern for the safety of witnesses who'd courageously agreed to cooperate with their investigation. Marshal, we've got civilians scattered around town who are in immediate danger if this turns violent. Families with children, elderly folks who couldn't defend themselves if things get ugly. Then we make sure things don't get ugly, Bradley replied grimly. Lieutenant Carson, I want you to position our men to protect the key witnesses. Sheriff Mercer, where are the Dawson woman and her daughter currently staying? Still at Mrs. Patterson's boarding house, along with Mrs. Stone and several other potential witnesses. Dr. Hayes has been making regular visits to check on everyone's safety. Bradley nodded approvingly. Good central location with multiple exits and good sight lines. We'll establish a perimeter around the boarding house and maintain protective custody for anyone who's cooperated with the investigation. The federal marshal's professional competence was reassuring, but Cole knew that badges and good intentions might not be enough against men who'd operated with impunity for years. The Gentlemen's Club had too much to lose and too many resources to simply accept arrest and prosecution without a fight. There's one more thing you should know, Cole said reluctantly. We have reason to believe they're preparing to abandon Millbrook entirely, relocate their operation to fresh territory, where they can start over with new identities and new victims. Marshal Bradley's expression darkened further. That changes our timeline considerably. If they're planning to run, they'll want to eliminate all evidence and witnesses before they leave. This could turn into a massacre if we're not careful. Sarah stood at the window, her trained eye cataloguing the movement of armed men through the town's streets. Marshal, they're not just preparing to run, they're preparing to fight. I count at least 20 armed men taking positions around Key. Buildings and more riders arriving from the direction of the ranches. The realization that Blackwood had assembled what amounted to a private army for whatever final confrontation was coming drove home the stakes they were facing. This wasn't just about bringing criminals to justice. It was about preventing a bloodbath that could destroy the entire community. Gentlemen, Miss Chen, Marshal Bradley said with the authority of federal jurisdiction, we're about to find out whether law and order can triumph over money and influence in this corner of the frontier. I suggest we prepare for the possibility that it's going to require more than badges and warrants to see justice served. As they made final preparations for what was beginning to look like an armed confrontation, Cole found his thoughts returning to his father's teachings about the weight of wearing a badge. Sometimes protecting people meant risking everything, including your own life, to stand between evil and innocence. Looking at the evidence scattered across his desk, at the courage in his allies' faces, at the federal support that had finally arrived, Cole knew they'd done everything possible to build a case that would survive legal challenges. Whether they'd live long enough to see it tried in court remained to be seen. Reverend Stone's body had been found at dawn, hanging from the bell tower of his own church with a suicide note that fooled no one who knew the man's character. Cole knelt beside the makeshift grave behind the church cemetery, studying the personal Bible that Elizabeth Stone had pressed into his hands before collapsing in grief. The leather-bound book was more than a religious text. It was the dead minister's final testimony, filled with coded messages and hidden names that revealed the true scope of the conspiracy he died trying to expose. The margins of Scripture were filled with Stone's careful handwriting, biblical references that masked contemporary observations about Millbrook's most respected citizens. "And he took the little children unto him," appeared beside notes about Thomas Blackwood's visits to the orphanage. "Suffer the little children" accompanied detailed observations about Mayor Whitman's involvement in selecting vulnerable families for the club's attention. Dr. Hayes looked up from examining the body, his medical training evident in the thorough way he documented details that contradicted the official narrative of suicide. "Sheriff, the rope marks are wrong for hanging. Someone strangled him first, then staged the scene to cover their tracks." Marshal Bradley crouched beside them, his federal authority carrying weight that local badges might not possess in the confrontation. "To come. Reverend Stone's murder represents a significant escalation. These men are no longer content with intimidation and economic pressure. They're willing to kill to protect their operation." The minister's hidden documentation provided the final pieces they'd needed to understand the Gentlemen's Club's methods. Stone had maintained careful records of children who'd confided in him about their abuse, families who'd sought spiritual guidance after suspicious injuries to their loved ones, and the systematic way the conspiracy had targeted the most vulnerable, members of their community. "Look at this entry," Sarah Chen said, pointing to a passage in the Book of Psalms where Stone had written careful notes in the margins. He identified the location where they held their special meetings, not just the abandoned mining office, but a second location where they took children for extended periods. The coded reference pointed to an old hunting cabin in the hills outside town, owned officially by the city but used exclusively by the Gentlemen's Club, for what Stone's notes suggested were weekend retreats that no child ever forgot. The isolation of the location would have made it perfect for crimes that required privacy and time. Cole felt his father's badge seemed to grow heavier as the implications sank in. If Stone's information was accurate, then children had been held captive for days at a time, subjected to abuse that went far beyond what they'd previously imagined. The systematic nature of the operation suggested planning and coordination that elevated their crimes from opportunistic exploitation to organized torture. "How many children are we talking about based on his records?" Marshal Bradley asked, though his expression suggested he dreaded the answer. Sarah counted carefully through Stone's coded entries, her schoolteacher's training helping her decipher his biblical references. "At least 37 children over 8 years, Sheriff. Some repeatedly, some who never returned to town afterward." The number hit like a physical blow. In a community of 800 souls, 37 children represented nearly an entire generation, scarred by systematic abuse. The scope of the trauma inflicted on Millbrook's families defied comprehension, yet the evidence continued to mount with each document they uncovered. Deputy Rodriguez appeared at Cole's shoulder, his young face grim with news that promised to complicate their already dangerous situation. "Sheriff, we've got riders approaching from 3 directions. Blackwood's men are taking positions around the church, and there are armed guards posted at every road leading out of town." The realization that they were being surrounded drove home the stakes of their confrontation. The Gentlemen's Club wasn't just preparing to defend themselves, they were setting up to eliminate everyone who could testify against them, turning Millbrook into a killing ground where witnesses would simply disappear. Marshal Bradley stood. With the efficient movements of a man accustomed to dangerous work, his federal authority evident in the way he took command of the situation. "Sheriff, how many armed men can you count on if this turns into a shooting war?" Cole mentally catalogued the resources at their disposal. Himself, Sam, the 3 federal marshals, and perhaps a handful of townspeople who might stand with law and order against their neighbors' corruption. Against them stood the Gentlemen's Club, with their hired gunmen, their economic influence, and their willingness to commit murder to protect their crimes. Maybe 8 men we can trust completely, Cole admitted. But Marshal, half this town has families who depend on Blackwood and his associates for their livelihoods. They might not actively help them, but they won't fight against them either. Then we make sure they don't have to choose sides, Bradley replied grimly. We end this before it becomes a war that tears the community apart. Sarah Chen had been studying Stone's Bible with the methodical attention she brought to everything, and her discovery drew everyone's focus back to the evidence they'd been building. There's something else here that changes everything, Reverend. Stone documented specific dates when children were transported to other locations, and some of those dates correspond to territorial officials visiting Millbrook. The implication was staggering. If Stone's coded observations were accurate, the Gentlemen's Club's operation extended beyond local corruption to include territorial officials who participated in their crimes during official visits. The scope of the conspiracy reached into the highest levels of frontier government. Which officials? Marshal Bradley demanded, his federal authority suddenly carrying even greater weight if corruption extended to his own chain of command. Sarah read carefully from Stone's biblical annotations, translating his coded language into contemporary terms. Judge Morrison hosted visits from Territorial Attorney General Harrison in 1884 and 1885. Both visits coincided with what Stone called special celebrations involving children from the orphanage. The revelation that territorial law enforcement officials might be complicit in the conspiracy explained how the Gentlemen's Club had operated with impunity for so long. If the very authorities who should have investigated their crimes were instead participating in them, then local resistance had been doomed from the start. That explains why our requests for territorial intervention have been ignored, Cole realized. They weren't being delayed by bureaucracy. They were being suppressed by people who had as much to lose as the local conspirators. Dr. Hayes looked up from his continued examination of Reverend Stone's body, his medical training revealing details that painted an even grimmer picture of their situation. Sheriff, this man fought his attacker. There's tissue under his fingernails, defensive wounds on his hands, evidence that he struggled before being overpowered. The discovery that Stone hadn't gone quietly to his death, that he'd fought to preserve the evidence that might bring justice for Millbrook's children, added another layer of urgency to their mission. The minister had died trying to protect others. They couldn't let his sacrifice be meaningless. We need to get this information to authorities outside the territorial system, Marshal Bradley decided. Federal judges in Denver, military commanders, who aren't connected to the local power structure, anyone with jurisdiction who can act on evidence of this magnitude. A distant sound made them all freeze, the rhythmic pounding of multiple horses approaching at speed, too many riders moving too fast for ordinary business. Cole peered around the church corner, counting at least 15 armed men converging on their position with the professional coordination that marked experienced fighters. Everyone into the church, he ordered quietly. Stone's sanctuary might provide some protection, and the stone walls will stop most rifle rounds. As they gathered their evidence and prepared to take defensive positions, Cole couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into a trap that had been years in the making. The Gentlemen's Club had eliminated their most dangerous opponent in Reverend Stone, seized control of the key institutions that might have protected their victims, and now commanded enough firepower to silence anyone who threatened their operation. But, looking at Stone's Bible clutched in Sarah's hands, at the determination in Marshal Bradley's eyes, at the courage that had brought them all to this moment, despite the overwhelming odds, Cole knew they had something their opponents lacked. They had the truth, documented in multiple sources by people who'd risked everything to preserve it. The church door slammed shut behind them as the sound of approaching riders grew louder, hoofbeats echoing off the surrounding buildings like thunder before a storm. Through the stained glass windows, Cole could see armed figures taking positions around the church with the methodical efficiency of men who'd planned this confrontation carefully. "Sheriff," Martha Dawson's voice carried from the back of the sanctuary, where she'd been waiting with Hattie and several other witness families. "Are we going to die here?" The question hung in the air between them, honest fear from someone who'd already sacrificed everything to seek justice for her daughter. Cole touched his father's badge through his shirt, feeling its familiar weight. "Settle into something approaching peace. Mrs. Dawson, I can't promise we'll all survive what's coming," he replied, with the honesty that his father had taught him was the foundation of wearing a badge. "But I can promise that if we don't make it, the evidence we've gathered will." Deputy Rodriguez has already sent copies to federal authorities beyond the territorial system. Whatever happens here, the truth about what these men have done will survive. Hattie spoke up from her wheelchair, her young voice carrying a strength that belied her 8 years and the trauma she'd endured. "Sheriff Cole, my papa used to say that sometimes doing right means doing hard. He said, that's when you find out what you're really made of." The wisdom from a child who'd suffered more than most adults would ever face drove home the stakes of their confrontation. This wasn't just about law enforcement or federal jurisdiction. It was about whether innocence and truth could triumph over power and corruption in their small corner of the world. Outside, Thomas Blackwood's voice carried across the churchyard, with the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "Sheriff Mercer, Marshal Bradley, you're surrounded by 20 armed men with orders to ensure this situation doesn't spread beyond Millbrook's borders. Come out now, and we might be able to reach an understanding." The offer of negotiation from men who'd just murdered a minister was obviously a trap, but it also represented an opportunity to buy time while they prepared for what was beginning to look like a final confrontation. Cole exchanged glances with Marshal Bradley, seeing the same grim calculation in the federal officer's eyes. "What kind of understanding, Blackwood?" Cole called back, his voice carrying the authority of his badge even in their desperate circumstances. "The kind where everyone walks away from this alive," Blackwood replied. "The kind where certain evidence disappears, certain witnesses relocate to distant territories, and certain federal officers decide their jurisdiction doesn't extend to local matters after all." The blatant attempt at bribery and intimidation confirmed that the Gentlemen's Club still believed they could control the situation through their traditional methods of corruption and threats. But the presence of federal marshals and the documentation they'd compiled represented variables that Blackwood and his associates might have miscalculated. Marshal Bradley stepped to the church door, his federal authority evident in every word. "Mr. Blackwood, you and your associates are under federal indictment for crimes against children, conspiracy, and murder. Surrender now, and you'll face justice in federal court. Continue this armed resistance, and you'll face military intervention." The silence that followed Bradley's declaration stretched taut as a bowstring, filled with the weight of decisions that would determine whether law or corruption would triumph in Millbrook. Through the church windows, Cole could see armed figures shifting positions, preparing for whatever came next. "Last chance, Sheriff," Blackwood called. "Some fights can't be won, no matter how right you think you are. Sometimes wisdom means knowing when to walk away." The faded adoption papers trembled in Cole's hands as he read his own name written in careful script across documents he'd never seen before. His birth certificate, orphanage records, transfer papers, all bearing the signatures of officials he'd grown up respecting, all confirming a truth that reframed every memory of his childhood in Millbrook. Sheriff Cole Mercer, protector of the innocent, had once been among the most vulnerable children in the very system he was now fighting to expose. Martha Dawson had brought the documents from her store's back room, where she'd kept them hidden since her late husband's death 3 years earlier. "James found these in the old City Hall records when he was doing construction work," she explained, her voice thick with emotion. "He didn't know how to tell you the truth about where you came from, but he thought you deserved to know someday. The orphanage intake form was dated 1863, when Cole would have been 4 years old. The child described in the clinical language of institutional documentation bore little resemblance to the confident lawman he'd become, but the physical description and identifying marks matched perfectly. Most damning of all was the notation. In Mrs. Eleanor Price's handwriting, subject shows signs of previous trauma, suitable for special programs. Dr. Hayes looked up from examining the documents with the same medical attention he'd given to all their evidence. Sheriff, according to these records, you spent 2 years in the orphanage before being adopted by William and Mary Mercer. The timing corresponds to when Mrs. Price first began her special arrangements with certain community members. The implication settled in Cole's stomach like cold lead. He'd been one of the children targeted by the conspiracy they were now investigating. The respect and trust he'd always felt for his adoptive father's memory, the pride he took in wearing the family badge, the very sense of identity that had driven him to law enforcement, all of it had been built on a foundation of buried trauma and selective memory. Sarah Chen studied the papers with her school teacher's eye for detail, finding connections that the adults might have missed. Cole, look at the adoption records. Your adoptive father wasn't just any citizen who wanted a child. He was specifically recommended by the same men who are now trying to kill us. The documentation showed that William Mercer had been approached by Thomas Blackwood and Mayor Whitman as part of what they called a community service program to place orphaned children with suitable families. The language was carefully neutral, but the signatures and witness statements revealed the same network of influence that had protected the Gentlemen's Club's operations for decades. They gave me to a good man, Cole said slowly, trying to process the implications of what they'd discovered. But why? If I was part of their collection, why place me with someone who would raise me to fight against everything they represented? Marshal Bradley had been studying the documents with the professional attention that had made him an effective federal officer, and his analysis provided a chilling answer. Sheriff, look at the medical records attached to your adoption papers. You're described as non-compliant and resistant to training. I think they placed you with the Mercer family because you were too much trouble to keep in their program. The revelation that his survival had depended on his own childish defiance, that his refusal to submit had inadvertently saved him from years of systematic abuse, brought tears to Cole's eyes. How many other children had lacked his stubbornness? How many had been broken by experiences he'd somehow endured and forgotten? There's more, Martha continued, her voice barely above a whisper. James found records of other adoptions, other children who were placed with families after showing signs of problems. Most of them were sent far away, to territories where they could never come back and ask questions. The pattern became clear as they studied the additional documents Martha's husband had preserved. Children who proved troublesome to the conspiracy were quietly removed from the community through legitimate adoptions, while more compliant victims remained in the orphanage or with carefully selected foster families who wouldn't interfere with their abuse. Hattie wheeled her chair closer to Cole's side, her small hand reaching out to touch his arm, with the instinctive compassion that had marked her character despite everything she'd endured. Sheriff Cole, is that why you understand? Is that why you believe us when other grown-ups don't? The child's insight cut straight to the heart of what Cole was feeling. His entire career in law enforcement, his instinctive protection of the vulnerable, his ability to connect with traumatized children, it all made sense now in the context of his own buried experiences. He'd been fighting the same battle his whole life, just from a different side of the badge. Dr. Hayes cleared his throat diplomatically, his medical training helping him navigate the emotional minefield they'd stumbled into. Sheriff, there are therapeutic implications to consider. Suppressed memories of childhood trauma can resurface under stress, particularly when confronting similar situations in adult life. As if summoned by the doctor's words, fragmented images began surfacing in Cole's mind. Dark rooms, adult voices making promises that were really threats, the taste of bitter medicine that made everything seem dreamlike and unreal. The laudanum they'd found in recent victims wasn't a new technique. It was something the conspiracy had been using for years to control and silence their targets. The red door room at the orphanage, Cole said suddenly, the memory rising like bile in his throat. I remember a red door, and Mrs. Price saying I was too difficult, too much trouble for the special programs. Sarah's face went pale as she realized the significance of what Cole was remembering. Hattie drew the red door room. You were there, weren't you? You were one of the children they tried to, but failed, Cole interrupted, his voice growing stronger as he processed the implications. They failed because I was too stubborn to break, too difficult to control, and when they couldn't use me, they found someone good to raise me instead. The irony was profound. The conspiracy that had tried to destroy him as a child had inadvertently created their most dangerous opponent. By placing him with William Mercer, they'd ensured he would grow up with the values and training necessary to expose their crimes decades later. Sheriff, Martha said softly, James always wondered if there was a reason you became such a good lawman. If maybe God had a plan for you to come back and protect other children the way nobody protected you. The theological implications of what she was suggesting resonated with the same biblical language that Reverend Stone had used to hide his observations about the conspiracy. Perhaps there was a divine justice in the way events had unfolded, bringing Cole full circle to confront the evil that had shaped his earliest years. Deputy Rodriguez entered through the church's back entrance, his face grim with news that threatened to complicate their already desperate situation. Sheriff, Blackwood's men are getting impatient out there. They've started a fire in the orphanage building. Looks like they're destroying evidence. The smell of smoke drifted through the church windows, carrying with it the destruction of records that might have provided additional evidence of the conspiracy's crimes. But more importantly, the fire represented an escalation in Blackwood's willingness to take irreversible actions. They're burning their bridges, Marshal Bradley observed grimly. Whatever they're planning, they don't intend to leave any trace of their operation behind. Cole stood at the church window, watching flames consume the building where his childhood trauma had begun, feeling a strange sense of closure as the physical structure that had housed so much pain collapsed into ash and memory. The destruction of evidence was troubling, but the symbolic elimination of the place where the conspiracy had operated felt like a form of liberation. Maybe that's fitting, he said quietly. Maybe some places need to burn before healing can begin. Sarah gathered their accumulated evidence, medical records, school observations, financial documents, and Reverend Stone's biblical testimony, into a portable collection that represented months of careful investigation. Whatever happens. Next, we've documented enough to ensure justice survives even if we don't. The sound of splintering wood drew their attention to the church's main entrance, where Blackwood's men were beginning to force their way inside. The time for negotiation and evidence gathering had passed. They were about to face the final confrontation that would determine whether truth or power would triumph in Millbrook. As Cole checked his sidearm and prepared to defend the innocent people who'd trusted him with their lives, he felt his father's badge settle into place with new meaning. He wasn't just William Mercer's adopted son, carrying on a family tradition of law enforcement. He was a survivor, returning to confront the evil that had tried to destroy him as a child. The boy who'd been too stubborn to break had become the man who would break the conspiracy that had terrorized his community for nearly a decade. Sometimes, Cole realized, the greatest victories came from refusing to surrender to forces that seemed overwhelming. Everyone stay low and stay together. He called to the families huddled in the sanctuary. We've come too far to give up now. The complete membership roster of the Gentlemen's Club lay spread across the church altar like a map of corruption, its pages revealing connections that stretched far beyond Millbrook's borders into a network of powerful men who'd built their influence on the systematic destruction of innocence. Sarah Chen had discovered the document hidden in Reverend Stone's personal effects, bound in leather and secured with a lock that had required Marshal Bradley's federal authority to break. Names filled the carefully maintained ledger in elegant script, organized by location and influence level. Thomas Blackwood and Mayor Whitman were merely local representatives of something much larger, a territorial organization with members in Santa Fe, Denver, and even Washington itself. Judges, lawmakers, military officers, and business leaders formed a web of mutual protection that had operated for over 15 years. Cole studied the roster with the methodical attention his father had taught him to bring to important evidence. But his newfound understanding of his own connection to the conspiracy added emotional weight to every entry. These weren't just names on a page. They were men who'd profited from the suffering of children like himself, protected by positions of trust and authority that should have made them guardians rather than predators. Look at the financial records attached to each name, Dr. Hayes said grimly, his medical training evident in the careful way he documented what they were discovering. They weren't just abusing children, they were trafficking them, moving victims between locations, sharing resources across multiple territories. The scope of what they'd uncovered defied the worst fears they'd harbored about local corruption. This wasn't a small-town conspiracy that had grown out of control. It was a carefully organized criminal enterprise that had used Millbrook as one of many operational bases for crimes that spanned the entire frontier region. Deputy Rodriguez positioned himself at the church's rear window, his young eyes tracking the movement of armed men who continued to tighten their cordon around the building. "Sheriff, they've got the church completely surrounded now. At least 30 gunmen, maybe more, and they're bringing up what looks like dynamite." The threat of explosives elevated their situation from armed standoff to potential massacre. Blackwood and his associates were clearly prepared to destroy the entire church rather than allow the evidence they'd compiled to reach federal prosecutors. The lives of everyone inside, witnesses, children, and law enforcement officers alike, had become acceptable casualties in their effort to protect the conspiracy. Marshal Bradley studied the membership roster with the professional assessment that had made him effective in federal law enforcement. But Cole could see the growing concern in the older man's face. "Sheriff, if this document is accurate, we're looking at corruption that reaches into my own chain of command. Some of these names represent people who could shut down our investigation at the federal level." The revelation that territorial and federal officials were complicit in the conspiracy explained how the Gentlemen's Club had operated with impunity for so long. Their protection hadn't come just from local influence. It had been backed by the highest levels of government, ensuring that investigations would be suppressed and witnesses silenced before they could threaten the organization's operations. Sarah moved among the witness families with the calm efficiency that had made her an effective teacher, helping parents position their children in the safest areas of the sanctuary while maintaining the emotional support that kept panic from taking hold. Her courage in the face of overwhelming danger provided inspiration for everyone who'd risked everything to seek justice. "Mrs. Dawson," she said quietly to Martha, who was holding Hattie close while trying to control her own fear, "your daughter's bravery started all of this. Because she found the strength to speak the truth, we've been able to expose crimes that might have continued for decades." Hattie looked up from her wheelchair with the wisdom that trauma had forced upon her young years. "Miss Sarah, are we going to die because I told the truth?" The question hung in the smoky air of the sanctuary, honest fear from a child who'd already suffered more than most adults would ever face. Cole knelt beside her wheelchair, his newly understood connection too. her experience giving weight to his words. "Hattie, sometimes telling the truth is the most dangerous thing a person can do," he said gently. "But it's also the most important. Your papa was right. Doing right means doing hard, and you've been the bravest person in this whole town." Martha's tears reflected the impossible choice that had brought them to this moment. Protecting her daughter by staying silent, or seeking justice by risking everything they had left. "Sheriff, I keep thinking about all the other children over the years, all the families who suffered alone because they were too afraid to speak up. The weight of untold suffering pressed down on everyone in the sanctuary, the knowledge that their current danger was nothing compared to the systematic abuse that had destroyed dozens of young lives over more than a decade. The conspiracy hadn't just committed individual crimes, it had wounded an entire community in ways that might never fully heal. "We have copies of everything," Marshal Bradley assured the assembled witnesses, his federal authority providing what comfort it could in their desperate circumstances. "Even if they destroy this building and everyone in it, the evidence will survive. Federal courts in 3 different territories already have documentation of what we've discovered." The sound of approaching horses drew everyone's attention to the windows, where a new group of riders was arriving to reinforce Blackwood's forces. But these weren't more hired gunmen. Their uniforms and bearing marked them as cavalry from the territorial garrison, riding under federal colors that should have represented rescue rather than additional threat. "Those are federal troops," Deputy Rodriguez observed with confusion that quickly turned to alarm. "But they're taking positions with Blackwood's men, not against them." The arrival of military support for the conspiracy rather than for law enforcement confirmed their worst fears about how deeply corruption had penetrated territorial government. The federal authority that should have protected them was instead being used to ensure their silence, turning their refuge into a trap with no possible escape. Cole felt his father's badge seem to burn against his chest as the full hopelessness of their situation became clear. They'd gathered evidence that could destroy a criminal network spanning multiple territories, but the very institutions that should have prosecuted that evidence were instead protecting it. Justice had been corrupted at every level, leaving them isolated against overwhelming force. "Sheriff," Elizabeth Stone spoke from where she'd been maintaining quiet vigil over her husband's Bible, "my husband wrote something in the back of this book. Something about what to do when all human institutions fail." She opened to pages Cole hadn't seen before, where Reverend Stone had copied passages from various sources, legal precedents, territorial statutes, even military regulations that dealt with situations where local authority had been completely compromised by criminal influence. "Citizens Arrest Authority," Cole read aloud, his legal training recognizing the implications immediately. "When federal, territorial, and local law enforcement have been compromised, citizens have the legal right to detain criminals and seek justice through any uncompromised court system." The legal precedent offered a theoretical path forward, but their practical situation remained desperate. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and surrounded by men who demonstrated their willingness to commit murder to protect their crimes. Legal authority meant nothing if they didn't survive to exercise it. Dr. Hayes had been examining the medical supplies in his bag, his professional training evident in the methodical way he prepared for what was coming. "Sheriff, I can treat gunshot wounds, but not for 30 people at once. If this turns into a shooting war, we're going to lose people we can't afford to lose." The stark medical assessment drove home the reality that their resistance would likely end in tragedy for the very people they'd tried to protect. The children and families who'd courageously stepped forward to seek justice were now facing death because of their willingness to trust in law and order. "Maybe that's exactly what they're counting on," Sarah said with sudden understanding. "They want us to surrender because we're afraid for the witnesses. They're using our compassion against us." The psychological warfare aspect of their situation became clear as Cole considered Sarah's observation. The conspiracy had surrounded them, with overwhelming force, not necessarily to kill them immediately, but to force them into submission through fear for innocent lives. It was the same tactic they'd used for years to silence victims and witnesses, threatening those who couldn't protect themselves to control those who could. Thomas Blackwood's voice carried across the churchyard with renewed authority, backed now by military support that made his position seemingly unassailable. "Sheriff Mercer, Marshal Bradley, you've seen the federal troops. Your own government has decided this situation needs to be contained rather than prosecuted. Come out now, and we can arrange relocations for everyone inside, new identities, fresh starts in territories where this unfortunate business will be forgotten." The offer of witness relocation sounded reasonable until Cole considered the source, and the pattern of relocated children who'd never been heard from again. Blackwood wasn't offering protection. He was offering a more subtle form of elimination that would remove witnesses while maintaining plausible deniability. "What about the evidence we've already sent to federal courts?" Cole called back, testing whether Blackwood knew the full extent of their preparations. "Evidence can be discredited, Sheriff. Witnesses can be shown to be unreliable. Federal judges can be convinced that territorial matters should be handled at the territorial level. You'd be surprised how reasonable people become when the proper incentives are applied." The casual admission that federal courts could be corrupted through bribery or intimidation eliminated their last hope for justice through legitimate channels. If the conspiracy could reach into federal courts in multiple territories, then no legal institution was beyond their influence. Hattie tugged at Cole's sleeve, her small voice cutting through the despair that was settling over the sanctuary like fog. "Sheriff Cole, what would your papa have done? Your real papa who raised you?" The question brought back memories of William Mercer's teachings about the weight of wearing a badge, about the responsibility to stand between evil and innocence, even when the odds were impossible. His adoptive father had never faced anything like their current situation, but his principles provided guidance that transcended specific circumstances. "He would have stood his ground," Cole replied, touching his father's badge through his shirt. "He would have said that sometimes doing right means accepting that you might not live to see the results, but that doesn't change what right is." The simple wisdom that had guided 3 generations of lawmen in the Mercer family crystallized their choice into stark terms. They could surrender and hope that men who'd murdered children for profit would show mercy to witnesses, or they could make their stand, knowing that justice sometimes required the ultimate sacrifice from those sworn to serve it. Marshal Bradley checked his weapon with the methodical efficiency that had kept him alive through 2 decades of dangerous federal service. "Sheriff, your father sounds like he was a wise man. I think he'd be proud of the lawman he raised." As they made final preparations for what was beginning to look like their last stand, Cole found himself thinking about the children whose voices had been silenced over the years, the families who'd suffered in isolation, the community that had been systematically brutalized by men who wore faces of respectability. Their deaths wouldn't restore the innocence that had been stolen, but their resistance might ensure that the truth survived to prevent future victims. Outside, the sound of military preparations continued as federal troops coordinated with hired gunmen to eliminate the last obstacle to the conspiracy's continued operation. Inside the sanctuary, witnesses and law enforcement officers prepared to make the same choice that had defined heroes throughout history, whether to submit to overwhelming evil or die fighting against it. Cole looked around at the faces of people who'd trusted him with their safety, knowing that his decisions in the next few hours would determine whether their courage had meaning beyond the immediate moment. The badge he wore had never felt heavier, but it had never felt more necessary either. The ceremonial ring lay heavy in Cole's palm, its distinctive signet bearing the intertwined serpents that had marked members of the Gentlemen's Club during their crimes. Thomas Blackwood had worn it to every church service for 8 years, its gold surface polished to mirror brightness while hiding the dark purposes it represented. Now, torn from Blackwood's finger during their desperate struggle, it provided the final piece of evidence that would connect specific individuals to specific victims in courts of law. The confrontation had begun when Marshal Bradley made his choice to honor his federal oath rather than the corrupt orders transmitted through compromised territorial channels. "I swore to protect the innocent," he declared, drawing his weapon on the federal troops who'd arrived to silence witnesses rather than seek justice. "That oath doesn't change based on political convenience." The first gunshots had shattered the sanctuary's stained glass windows, sending colored fragments cascading onto the church pews, where families huddled for protection. Cole had positioned himself between the main entrance and the witnesses, his father's badge catching the light from burning oil lamps as he prepared to make the stand that 3 generations of Mercers had trained him for. "Sheriff, they're coming." Through the bell tower, Deputy Rodriguez called from his position at the rear window, his young voice steady despite the chaos erupting around them. Sam had proven himself worthy of the badge Cole had pinned on him 3 years earlier, showing courage under fire that would have impressed his more experienced colleagues. Dr. Hayes moved among the wounded with professional calm, his medical training invaluable as the battle raged around them. Sarah Chen had organized the children into the safest corner of the sanctuary, her teacher's instincts adapting to protect young lives under circumstances no classroom had prepared her for. The ring had come into Cole's possession when Blackwood himself forced entry through the main doors, his commanding presence intact even in the midst of armed conflict. The man who'd terrorized Millbrook's children for nearly a decade faced the sheriff who'd been among his earliest victims, neither fully understanding the cosmic justice of their confrontation. "You could have been one of us, Mercer," Blackwood had snarled during their hand-to-hand struggle, his breath reeking of whiskey and desperation. "We offered you power, position, everything a man could want. Instead, you chose to protect the weak. My father taught me that protecting the weak is what makes a man strong," Cole had replied, driving his fist into Blackwood's jaw with force that carried 20 years of buried rage. The blow had sent the rancher sprawling, his ceremonial ring spinning across the wooden floor to rest at the base of the altar. Martha Dawson clutched Hattie's wheelchair with protective fury, her mother's instincts transforming her into a fierce guardian who would die before allowing her daughter to suffer further harm. "This ends today," she declared to anyone who could hear above the gunfire. "Whatever happens to us, this ends today." The ring's significance became clear as Cole examined its intricate design while taking cover behind an overturned pew. The serpents weren't just decorative. They formed a coded symbol that members used to identify each other during their crimes. Hattie's drawings had shown this same symbol, though she'd been too young to understand its meaning when she'd witnessed it during her own abuse. "Sheriff!" Elizabeth Stone called from beside her husband's body, which they'd moved into the sanctuary for protection. "The Bible! There's something about the rings in his notes." Cole crawled across the bullet-scarred floor to reach the minister's widow, bullets whining overhead as Blackwood's men attempted to storm the sanctuary through multiple entrances. Stone's biblical annotations included detailed observations about the ceremonial jewelry worn by club members, noting how the rings served both as identification and as instruments of psychological control over their victims. He wrote that they forced children to kiss the rings before the abuse began, Elizabeth said, her voice thick with revulsion and grief. A ritual that marked the beginning of their suffering and ensured they would remember the symbol that represented their powerlessness. The revelation added another layer of horror to crimes that had already defied comprehension, but it also provided crucial evidence that would make prosecution possible. The rings weren't just jewelry. They were tools of psychological torture that created lasting trauma in ways that medical examinations alone couldn't document. Marshal Bradley had barricaded himself behind the church organ, using its massive wooden frame for protection while coordinating their defense against increasingly desperate attacks from multiple directions. "Sheriff, we've got maybe 10 minutes before they bring up that dynamite. After that, this whole building comes down, regardless of who's inside." The time constraint focused everyone's attention on their immediate survival rather than long-term justice concerns. They'd gathered evidence that could destroy the conspiracy, but only if someone lived to present it in court. The ring in Cole's possession represented both their greatest triumph and their most urgent vulnerability. "We need to get the evidence and witnesses out of here," Cole realized, studying the church's layout for escape routes that might have been overlooked. "The basement connects to the old mining tunnels. If we can reach them, we might be able to evacuate everyone underground." Sarah Chen looked up from her protective position with the children, her teacher's practicality cutting through the emotional chaos surrounding them. "Sheriff, the tunnels haven't been used in years. They could be flooded, collapsed, or filled with dangerous gases from the mines. Better than certain death from dynamite," Dr. Hayes observed grimly, his medical assessment taking precedence over theoretical risks. "I can treat injuries from tunnel accidents. I can't resurrect people from explosions." The sound of splintering wood announced that their defensive positions were being systematically overwhelmed by attackers with superior numbers and firepower. Blackwood's hired gunmen had experience in this kind of work, while Cole's defenders were mostly civilians whose courage exceeded their combat training. "Everyone who can't fight needs to start moving toward the basement," Cole ordered, his authority carrying the weight of desperation rather than confidence. "Sam, can you cover the rear while I hold the main entrance?" Deputy Rodriguez nodded. Grimly, blood streaming from a bullet grazed across his forehead that hadn't slowed his determined resistance. "Sheriff, it's been an honor serving under you. Whatever happens down there, make sure they pay for what they've done to these children." The ring seemed to burn in Cole's pocket as he helped Martha maneuver Hattie's wheelchair toward the narrow stairs leading to the church basement. Behind them, the sound of gunfire intensified as their defensive perimeter continued to collapse under overwhelming assault. Hattie looked up at him with eyes that had seen too much suffering for her 8 years, but also carried a strength that had inspired their entire resistance. "Sheriff Cole, are you scared?" The honest question from a child who'd already endured worse fears than most adults would ever face deserved an honest answer. "Yes, Hattie, I'm scared. But being scared doesn't mean we stop doing what's right. Sometimes it means we do what's right even though we're scared." The wisdom that trauma had forced upon both of them created a bond that transcended the difference in their ages and circumstances. They were survivors of the same evil, separated by decades, but united by their refusal to let that evil continue unopposed. Elizabeth Stone clutched her husband's Bible as she descended the basement stairs, his final testimony preserved in annotations that had cost him his life to compile. "Sheriff, my husband believed that sometimes God works through imperfect people to achieve perfect justice. I think he would see divine purpose in the way you've brought all this evidence together." The theological perspective offered comfort that practical considerations couldn't provide, but Cole knew that divine justice required human action to manifest in the world. They'd been instruments of that justice, but their effectiveness would be measured by their ability to survive long enough to see it served. The church basement was a maze of storage rooms and forgotten spaces that had accumulated decades of dust and neglect. But Cole's childhood memories, suddenly accessible since learning about his origins, provided guidance that surprised everyone, including himself. "There's a passage behind the old furnace," he said with certainty that came from suppressed recollection. "I remember playing down here when I was small, before my adoption. The passage connects to the mine shafts that run under the whole town." Martha looked at him with new understanding, recognizing that his recovered memories were providing their escape route in ways that seemed too convenient to be mere coincidence. James always said there were reasons why certain people ended up in certain places at certain times. Maybe this is one of those times. The passage was exactly where Cole remembered it, though smaller than his adult frame had anticipated. They would have to move single file through spaces designed for children's games rather than adult escape routes, carrying their evidence and protecting their witnesses through tunnels that might extend for miles underground. "Sheriff," Dr. Hayes called softly from the rear of their evacuation column. "Mrs. Stone is having chest pains. I think the stress and exertion are more than her heart can handle." The elderly woman had already sacrificed her husband's life to preserve evidence of the conspiracy's crimes. Now her own health was failing under the pressure of seeing justice served, despite overwhelming odds against survival. "We don't leave anyone behind," Cole declared with finality that brooked no argument. "We all get out together, or we all go down fighting together." Above them, the sound of explosions announced that Blackwood's forces had begun their final assault on the church sanctuary. The building that had provided shelter for their resistance was being systematically destroyed, but the evidence they'd compiled and the witnesses they'd protected were moving toward safety through passages that their enemies couldn't follow. The ring in Cole's pocket represented more than just evidence. It was a symbol of power that had been torn from the hands of those who'd wielded it against the innocent. For the first time in nearly a decade, the Gentlemen's Club faced opposition that couldn't be intimidated, corrupted, or eliminated through their traditional methods. Justice was finally within reach, but only if they could survive long enough to grasp it. Hattie's new wheelchair gleamed in the morning light, filtering through the courthouse windows. Its specially crafted wheels and comfortable seat representing more than mobility. It symbolized a community's commitment to supporting survivors and moving forward together. Hans Miller, the town's carpenter, had worked through 3 sleepless nights to create something beautiful from the ashes of tragedy, his skilled hands crafting hope from heartbreak. The final confrontation had ended not with explosions and gunfire, but with Thomas Blackwood's complete breakdown when faced with testimony from the children he'd brutalized over nearly a decade. Cole stood at the witness stand, his father's badge catching the courtroom light as he presented the ceremonial ring alongside medical records, financial documents, and Reverend Stone's biblical testimony. This ring was worn by the defendant during crimes against at least 17 children, Cole testified, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd survived similar trauma and returned to seek justice. The serpent design served as both identification among conspiracy members and as a tool of psychological control over their victims. Federal Judge Harrison, brought in from Denver specifically because territorial courts had been compromised, examined the evidence with the methodical attention that had made him respected throughout the Western Territories. His presence represented justice from outside the corrupted system that had protected the conspiracy for so long. Martha Dawson's powerful testimony had broken through Blackwood's arrogant facade, her mother's anguish giving voice to every family that had suffered in silence while respectable men destroyed their children's innocence. "You took my daughter's ability to walk," she'd said directly to Blackwood, her voice steady despite tears streaming down her face. "But you didn't take her spirit, and you didn't take our determination to see justice served." The courtroom had fallen silent as Hattie herself spoke from her new wheelchair, her 8-year-old voice carrying wisdom that trauma had forced upon her. "He said it only hurt the first time, but he lied about that too. It hurt every time, and it kept hurting, until Sheriff Cole made it stop." Dr. Hayes had provided clinical testimony that connected specific injuries to specific perpetrators, his medical expertise translating physical evidence into legal proof that even corrupt officials couldn't dismiss. The patterns of abuse were systematic and coordinated, he'd explained to the jury. These weren't isolated incidents. They were organized crimes carried out by men who used their positions of trust to prey upon the most vulnerable members of our community. Sarah Chen's educational documentation had revealed the broader scope of the conspiracy's impact on Millbrook's children, her careful observations providing context that medical records alone couldn't convey. Entire classrooms of children showed behavioral changes consistent with trauma, she'd testified. The conspiracy didn't just abuse individual victims, it wounded an entire generation. Mayor Whitman's attempt to claim ignorance of the conspiracy had crumbled under cross-examination that revealed financial records linking his office to payments that funded the operation. Edgar Mills's banking records showed systematic money laundering that had allowed the conspiracy to operate across multiple territories without detection by federal authorities. Mrs. Eleanor Price's confession had provided the most damning testimony of all, her detailed knowledge of the conspiracy's methods revealing how respected institutions had been perverted to serve criminal purposes. The orphanage was never about caring for children, she'd admitted under oath. It was about providing vulnerable victims to men who paid well for access to them. The revelation that Judge Morrison had provided the laudanum used to drug victims had eliminated any possibility of corruption within the current proceedings. His arrest during the trial had sent shockwaves through territorial legal circles, demonstrating that even the highest offices weren't immune from federal prosecution when evidence was overwhelming. Cole's personal testimony about his own childhood experiences had provided emotional weight that legal documents couldn't convey. His survival and successful career in law enforcement offering hope that healing was possible even after profound trauma. The badge I wear belonged to the man who saved me from this conspiracy by raising me with values that made me strong enough to return and fight it, he'd said. Justice isn't just about punishment. It's about ensuring that evil doesn't triumph over innocence. Marshal Bradley's federal authority had been crucial in maintaining order during proceedings that threatened to tear the community apart, his presence ensuring that intimidation tactics couldn't be used against witnesses who'd courageously stepped forward. The additional federal marshals stationed throughout the courthouse demonstrated that territorial corruption couldn't reach high enough to suppress justice when properly administered. The jury's verdict had been swift and unanimous, guilty on all counts for every defendant, with sentences that reflected the systematic nature of their crimes and the number of victims they'd destroyed over nearly a decade of operation. Federal jurisdiction ensured that appeals would be heard by courts outside the territorial system that had protected the conspiracy for so long. Thomas Blackwood's final words before sentencing had revealed the depth of his narcissistic delusion. You're destroying men who built this community, who provided jobs and stability for hundreds of families. Those children will forget their temporary discomfort, but the economic damage you're causing will last for generations. Judge Harrison's response had captured the moral clarity that had driven their investigation from the beginning. Mr. Blackwood, you and your associates didn't build this community. You poisoned it. You didn't provide stability. You provided a systematic campaign of terror against the most vulnerable citizens. The temporary discomfort you referenced destroyed lives, shattered families, and corrupted every institution that should have protected these children. The sentences reflected the severity of the crimes, life imprisonment for the primary perpetrators, with no possibility of parole or territorial clemency. Federal jurisdiction ensured that corruption at the local level couldn't reduce or overturn the punishments that justice demanded. Martha Dawson approached Cole after the sentencing, her gratitude evident despite the emotional exhaustion that marked everyone who'd participated in seeking justice. "Sheriff, Hattie wanted me to give you this," she said, handing him a drawing her daughter had made during the trial. The picture showed a man wearing a sheriff's badge, standing protectively in front of a group of children, his arms outstretched, to shield them from dark figures that were being led away in chains. Above the scene, Hattie had written in careful letters, "Good guys win sometimes." She said to tell you that sometimes doing right means doing hard, but it's always worth it. Martha added, her voice thick with emotion. She also said that your papa, both your papas, would be proud of the man you became. Sarah Chen joined them, her teacher's composure intact, despite everything they'd endured together. Sheriff, the school board has asked me to develop new protocols for identifying and reporting suspected abuse. Would you be willing to help train other educators about the warning signs we should watch for? The request represented hope that their experience could prevent future tragedies, that the knowledge they'd gained through pain could be used to protect other communities from similar conspiracies. Cole's unique perspective as both a law enforcement officer and a survivor could provide insights that might save other children from the trauma they'd all endured. Dr. Hayes approached with his medical bag, his professional demeanor softened by the relief that came with seeing justice finally served. Sheriff, I've been thinking about establishing a clinic specifically for treating childhood trauma. The medical community needs to understand better how to help victims heal from experiences like these. Elizabeth Stone stood quietly beside them, her husband's Bible clutched in her weathered hands. My husband always said that sometimes God works through human hands to achieve divine justice. I think he would see his death as meaningful if it helped bring about this result. Deputy Rodriguez, now wearing a sheriff's badge of his own after being elected to succeed Cole, represented continuity in law enforcement that would ensure the lessons learned wouldn't be forgotten. Sheriff, former sheriff, the town council wants to establish a memorial for all the victims, including those whose names we'll never know. They think it's important that this history be preserved. Cole looked around at the faces of people who'd trusted him with their safety and their hope for justice, recognizing that their courage had made the difference between success and failure. The badge he'd worn had carried the weight of 3 generations of lawmen, but it had never carried more significance than during the investigation that had brought them to this moment. Hattie wheeled her new chair closer, her young face bearing scars that would never completely heal, but also showing strength that would carry her through whatever challenges lay ahead. Sheriff Cole, what happens now? Are we safe forever? The question deserved an honest answer that acknowledged both their victory and the ongoing responsibility that came with it. Hattie, we're safer than we were, and other children will be safer because of what you found the courage to say. But staying safe means staying watchful and making sure that good people never stop fighting against evil people. The simple wisdom that had guided their investigation remained as relevant as ever. Protecting the innocent required constant vigilance from those strong enough to stand against corruption and evil. Their victory had been decisive, but it wasn't permanent unless future generations maintained the same commitment to justice. As they left the courthouse together, Cole felt his father's badge settle into its familiar weight against his chest with new meaning. He'd worn it to honor the man who'd raised him, but now he understood it also honored the children who'd suffered, the families who'd endured in silence, and the community that had finally found the strength to demand justice. The badge represented more than law enforcement. It represented the promise that someone would always stand between the innocent and those who would harm them, no matter how powerful or protected the predators might be. The memorial garden stone stood solid and permanent in Millbrook's town square, its polished granite surface bearing the simple inscription, "In memory of innocence stolen and courage found, may their voices never be silenced." 6 months after the trials that had torn apart and then rebuilt their community, the commemorative marker represented both an ending and a beginning, a promise that the children who had suffered would be remembered and their stories would prevent Future tragedies. Cole Mercer stood before the memorial in the early morning light, his father's badge catching the sun as he reflected on how profoundly their small frontier town had changed since that dusty Tuesday when Hattie Dawson first spoke. Words that would shake him to his very soul. The badge now carried different weight, not just the responsibility of 3 generations of lawmen, but the knowledge that justice sometimes required everything a person had to give. Behind him, the sounds of a community rebuilding itself drifted across the square. The orphanage had been demolished and replaced with a proper school that Sarah Chen now administered with protocols designed to protect rather than exploit vulnerable children. Mrs. Patterson's boarding house had been expanded to provide temporary shelter for families in crisis, ensuring that economic desperation never again forced parents to choose between survival and their children's safety. Hattie Dawson approached in her specially crafted wheelchair, her movements confident despite the limitations that would always mark her life. At 9 years old, she carried herself with dignity that belied her years, her experience having forged strength from suffering in ways that inspired everyone who knew her story. "Good morning, Sheriff Cole," she said with the formality that had marked their relationship since the trials. Despite his repeated invitations to simply call him Cole, she maintained the respect for his badge that had been part of their bond from the beginning. "Good morning, Hattie. How are you feeling today?" "Strong," she replied without hesitation, her blue eyes holding wisdom that trauma had forced upon her but hadn't broken. "Mama says I'm getting stronger every day, not just in my body, but in my heart too." Martha Dawson emerged from the general store that had somehow survived the economic upheaval following the conspiracy's exposure, her auburn hair catching the morning light as she joined them beside the memorial. The store had actually prospered as the community rallied around families who'd suffered, demonstrating that courage in facing evil could be rewarded as well as punished. "Sheriff, I wanted to thank you again for everything you did for us," Martha said, her voice carrying the gratitude that had marked their interactions since the trials ended. "Not just the investigation and the arrests, but the way you helped Hattie understand that speaking the truth was the right thing to do, no matter how scary it was." Cole touched his father's badge through his shirt, feeling its familiar weight. "Settle into something approaching peace. Mrs. Dawson, your daughter taught me as much as I taught her. Sometimes courage comes from the most unexpected places." Sarah Chen approached from the direction of the new school, her arms full of papers that marked the constant work of education and protection that had become her mission. As the school's principal and the territory's new expert on identifying childhood trauma, she'd developed training programs that were being implemented across the frontier. "Cole, I wanted to show you the latest letters from other communities requesting our assistance with their own investigations," she said, spreading the documents on the memorial's base. 17 different towns have reported suspicious patterns. After hearing about our success here, the scope of what they'd uncovered continued to expand even after the primary conspiracy had been eliminated. Their investigation had revealed not just local corruption, but territorial networks that had operated for decades, and communities across the region were finally finding the courage to examine their own institutions for similar abuse. Dr. Hayes joined them, his medical bag in hand as always, but his demeanor lighter than it had been in years. The weight of keeping terrible secrets had lifted from his shoulders, replaced by the satisfaction of using his expertise to help rather than simply document suffering. "Sheriff, I've received confirmation from the Territorial Medical Board that our protocols for identifying and treating childhood trauma are being adopted throughout the region," he reported. "The clinic we established has already treated 43 children from 7 different communities. The expansion of their healing work beyond Millbrook's borders represented hope that their painful experience could prevent similar tragedies elsewhere. Each child who received proper treatment, each family that found support instead of silence, each community that chose transparency over cover-up, was a victory that honored those who hadn't survived to see justice served. Deputy Sam Rodriguez, now Sheriff Rodriguez, approached with the measured stride of a man who'd learned to carry authority with wisdom rather than arrogance. His election to succeed Cole had been unanimous, the community recognizing that he'd proven himself during their darkest hours. "Cole, the federal marshals have requested your assistance with a case in Colorado Territory," Sam reported. "Sounds like they've found evidence of another organized conspiracy, and they want someone with experience in this kind of investigation." The request represented both recognition of Cole's expertise and an opportunity to expand their fight against institutional abuse beyond their own community's borders. But it also meant leaving behind the place where he'd finally understood his own origins and found peace with his childhood trauma. "What do you think, Sheriff?" Cole asked Sam, recognizing that the decision would affect more than just his own future. "I think you've got knowledge that could save other children's lives," Sam replied without hesitation. "And I think this community is strong enough now to protect itself while you're helping other communities find their own strength." Elizabeth Stone approached from the direction of the rebuilt church, her husband's Bible under her arm, as always, but her step lighter than it had been since his murder. The new minister respected her role as keeper of her husband's memory and the wisdom he'd died trying to share. "Cole, my husband always said that sometimes God gives people special purposes that they don't understand until they're living them," she said gently. "I think your purpose might be bigger than just Millbrook." The theological perspective offered comfort that practical considerations couldn't provide, but Cole knew that any decision about his future had to be made with full understanding of what he was leaving behind. This community had become more than his home. It was the place where he'd confronted his own past and found the strength to ensure that other children wouldn't suffer what he'd endured. Hattie wheeled closer, her small hand reaching out to touch, his arm with the instinctive compassion that had marked her character despite everything she'd experienced. "Sheriff Cole, if you go help other children like you helped me, does that mean you won't forget about us?" The question cut straight to the heart of his dilemma. Leaving Millbrook felt like abandoning the people who'd trusted him with their most precious treasures, their children's safety and their own hope for justice. But staying might mean that other communities would continue to suffer while he remained comfortable in his success. "Hattie, I could never forget about you or this town," he assured her. "You taught me that sometimes doing right means doing hard. Remember, maybe helping other children is the hard thing I need to do next." Martha nodded, with understanding that came from her own difficult choices during their investigation. "Sheriff, we'll always be grateful for what you did for us. But if other children need your help, we can't be selfish and keep you here just because we feel safer with you around." The generosity that had marked Millbrook's response to their tragedy extended even to letting go of the man who'd led them. Through it, the community that had been wounded by systematic abuse had healed enough to put other communities' needs ahead of their own comfort. Dr. Hayes cleared his throat diplomatically, his medical training evident in the careful way he approached sensitive topics. "Cole, I've been thinking about what your adoptive father would say about this decision. I think he'd tell you that wearing a badge means going where you're needed most, not staying where you're most comfortable." The wisdom that had guided 3 generations of Mercers in their service to justice provided clarity that emotional considerations couldn't offer. William Mercer had taught his adopted son that protecting the innocent sometimes required personal sacrifice. And that principle hadn't changed just because Cole had found peace in his own life. Sarah gathered her papers with the efficiency that marked all her work, but her expression carried sadness at the prospect of losing a colleague who'd become a friend. "Cole, if you decide to go, I want you to take copies of all our documentation. Other investigators might need the patterns we identified, the methods we developed for gaining children's trust. The practical aspect of sharing their hard-won expertise with other law enforcement officers appealed to Cole's desire to ensure their experience had meaning beyond Millbrook's borders. Every technique they'd developed, every mistake they'd learned from, every success they'd achieved could help other communities avoid the years of suffering that had marked their own journey to justice. The memorial stone caught the morning light. As clouds moved across the autumn sky, its polished surface reflecting the faces of people who'd found strength in each other during their darkest hours. The inscription had been Hattie's idea, her young wisdom recognizing that memory and courage were interconnected in ways that adults sometimes forgot. Cole made his decision with the certainty that came from understanding his purpose in ways that had eluded him for most of his adult life. He'd been saved from the conspiracy as a child, not just for his own benefit, but so he could return as an adult with the skills and authority necessary to destroy it. That same pattern might be repeating on a larger scale. "I'll go," he said simply, his hand touching his father's badge one final time in the place where it had gained its deepest meaning. "But I'll be back to check on all of you, and this will always be home." As he prepared to leave Millbrook for new challenges in distant territories, Cole carried with him more than just law enforcement experience. He carried the knowledge that evil could be defeated when good people found the courage to stand together, that truth could triumph over power when justice was pursued with wisdom and determination, and that healing was possible even after profound trauma. The badge he wore represented not just his own family's tradition of service, but every child who'd suffered in silence, every family that had endured alone, and every community that needed someone strong enough to stand between innocence and those who would destroy it. Behind him, the memorial stone stood permanent and solid, its inscription promising that the voices of the innocent would never be silenced as long as people like Cole Mercer wore badges with the understanding that protecting others was worth any personal cost. The fight for justice was far from over, but in Millbrook at least, the good guys had won.